The story of Atlantis begins not in the depths of the ocean or through archaeological discovery, but in the philosophical schools of ancient Athens around 360 BC. Within the marble colonnades of the Academy, the philosopher Plato crafted two dialogues that would spark centuries of speculation, debate and exploration. These works, the Timaeus and Critias, represent the sole ancient source for what would become one of history's most enduring mysteries. Plato's account emerges through the voice of Critias, a character based on his great-grandfather, who claims to have inherited the tale through a chain of oral tradition stretching back to the legendary Athenian lawgiver Solon. According to this narrative framework, Solon had travelled to Egypt around 590 BC, where Egyptian priests in the city of Sais revealed to him the ancient records of a great civilization that had existed 9,000 years before their time. The priests, keepers of temple archives that supposedly contained records spanning millennia, described a powerful island nation that had once threatened the known world before vanishing beneath the waves in a single day and night. The Timaeus dialogue serves primarily as an introduction to the Atlantis story, positioning it as a prelude to Plato's discussion of the ideal state and the cosmos. Here, Critias briefly outlines the basic premise. Ancient Athens had once stood as the epitome of the perfect state, successfully defending the Mediterranean world against the aggressive expansion of Atlantis. This preliminary account establishes the fundamental conflict between the virtuous, well-ordered Athenian state and the corrupt, imperialistic Atlantean empire. The Critias dialogue, though incomplete, provides the detailed description of Atlantis that has captivated imaginations for over 2 millennia. Plato describes an island larger than Libya, and Asia combined, situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. This geographical placement positioned Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, in waters that were supposedly impassable after the island's destruction due to shallow mud left by the catastrophe. The physical description of Atlantis reveals a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and wealth. The island consisted of alternating rings of land and water, with the central island measuring approximately 50 stadia in diameter, roughly 5.7 miles. These concentric circles were connected by tunnels large enough for ships to pass through, creating a complex system of harbours and waterways. The outermost ring of water served as a massive harbour capable of accommodating vast fleets of triremes and merchant vessels. The capital city's architecture reflected both military pragmatism and ostentatious display of wealth. Massive walls surrounded each ring, with the outer wall covered in brass, the middle wall coated in tin, and the innermost wall gleaming with orichalcum, a mysterious metal that Plato describes as second in value only to gold. These metallic surfaces would have created a dazzling spectacle, reflecting sunlight across the harbour and visible from great distances at sea. At the heart of the city stood the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon, the patron deity of Atlantis. This temple, measuring 600 feet in length, 300 feet in width, and proportionally tall, was constructed entirely of silver except for its golden pinnacles. Inside, a colossal gold statue of Poseidon driving 6 winged horses dominated the interior, reaching nearly to the ceiling. The temple grounds contained golden statues of the 10 original Atlantean kings and their wives, creating a pantheon of dynastic power frozen in precious metal. The Atlantean society that Plato describes operated under a unique governmental system combining elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and federalism. 10 kings, all descendants of Atlas, the firstborn son of Poseidon, ruled different regions of the island and its external territories. These rulers gathered every 5th and 6th year, alternately in the Temple of Poseidon, to deliberate on matters of common interest and to judge any infractions of their sacred laws, which were inscribed on a pillar of orichalcum within the temple. The military capabilities of Atlantis reflected its vast resources and population. Plato provides specific numbers. The island could field 60,000 leaders of soldiers, 120,000 hoplites, 180,000 archers, 180,000 slingers, 300,000 stone shooters and javelin men, 240,000 horsemen, and 60,000 chariots. The naval forces included 1,200 ships, each carrying 200 men. These figures suggest a total military force exceeding 1 million men, supported by a civilian population that must have numbered in the tens of millions. The economic foundation of this military machine rested on the island's extraordinary natural abundance. The fertile plains produced 2 harvests annually, watered by winter rains and summer irrigation from an elaborate canal system. The main canal, 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and 1,125 miles long, connected the capital to the sea, while smaller channels created a grid pattern across the rectangular plain, facilitating both irrigation and transportation. This agricultural productivity supported not only the massive population, but also extensive trade networks that brought exotic goods from across the known world. The technological achievements of Atlantis extended beyond agriculture and architecture. Plato describes sophisticated engineering projects including the excavation of harbours, the construction of bridges spanning the water rings, and the creation of underground passages for ships. The Atlanteans possessed advanced metallurgy, working not only with conventional metals, but also with the mysterious orichalcum, which they mined from the earth in many parts of the island. Yet beneath this veneer of prosperity and power, Plato weaves a narrative of moral decline that serves as the philosophical core of his account. Initially, the Atlanteans embodied virtue and wisdom, their divine heritage from Poseidon manifesting in just governance and noble character. However, as generations passed and the divine element in their nature became diluted through intermarriage with mortals, their character gradually deteriorated. They became consumed with material wealth, political ambition, and imperial expansion. This transformation from virtue to corruption represents the central allegorical message of Plato's narrative. The early Atlanteans, like the ideal citizens of Plato's Republic, possessed the cardinal virtues of wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice. Their society functioned harmoniously because each individual fulfilled their proper role according to their nature and abilities. The later Atlanteans, by contrast, exemplified the dangers of unchecked democracy and material excess that Plato observed in contemporary Athens. The timeline Plato establishes for these events places the Atlantis story approximately 9,600 years before his own era, around 9,500 BC. This dating positions the narrative in the immediate aftermath of the last ice age, a period when sea levels were indeed rising and coastal civilizations might have faced catastrophic flooding. However, the 9,000-year gap also conveniently places the events beyond the reach of any contemporary historical verification, lending the account an air of ancient authenticity while preventing factual challenges. The geographical location beyond the Pillars of Hercules similarly serves multiple narrative purposes. This placement removes Atlantis from the familiar Mediterranean world while positioning it as a genuine threat to the civilizations Plato's audience knew. The Atlantic Ocean represented the edge of the known world, a realm of mystery where extraordinary civilizations might plausibly have existed. The subsequent impassability of these waters due to mud shoals provides a convenient explanation for why no contemporary explorers had rediscovered the lost continent. The question of Plato's intent in creating the Atlantis narrative has generated scholarly debate for centuries. Several factors suggest that Plato conceived Atlantis primarily as a philosophical allegory rather than historical fact. The account appears exclusively in Plato's works, with no corroborating evidence from other ancient sources who would have had access to the same Egyptian records. The detailed numerical specifications, from military forces to architectural dimensions, display the systematic precision characteristic of Plato's theoretical constructions, rather than the approximate estimates typical of historical accounts. Furthermore, the Atlantis story serves specific philosophical and political purposes within the broader context of Plato's work. The contrast between virtuous ancient Athens and corrupt Atlantis mirrors the distinction between the ideal state described in the Republic and the degenerate democracies Plato criticized in contemporary Greece. The cyclical rise and fall of civilizations reflected Plato's theories about political change and the inevitable corruption of even the best-ordered states over time. The pedagogical function of the Atlantis narrative also supports its allegorical interpretation. Plato frequently employed myths and stories to illustrate abstract philosophical concepts, making complex ideas accessible through concrete imagery. The tale of Atlantis provides a vivid example of how material prosperity and military power, divorced from virtue and wisdom, inevitably lead to moral corruption and ultimate destruction. This lesson carried particular relevance for Plato's contemporaries, who had witnessed Athens' transformation from the defender of Greek freedom against Persian invasion to an aggressive imperial power whose overreach had led to defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The specific details of Atlantean society often mirror and critique aspects of Athenian civilization during its imperial period. The extensive naval forces, the tribute-paying subject territories, the magnificent public buildings funded by imperial wealth, and the gradual erosion of traditional values all reflected patterns that Plato's audience would have recognized from their own recent history. The catastrophic end of Atlantis served as a warning about the potential consequences of imperial hubris and moral decline. Yet the possibility remains that Plato drew inspiration from actual historical events or civilizations, even while crafting a primarily allegorical narrative. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC had witnessed the sudden disappearance of several advanced civilizations, including the Mycenaean Greeks and the Hittite Empire. Memories of these catastrophes might have survived in oral traditions, providing a historical foundation for Plato's fictional elaboration. The immediate aftermath of Plato's death in 347 BC marked the beginning of a complex intellectual legacy regarding his Atlantis narrative. Within the halls of the Academy and the Lyceum, Plato's most distinguished students grappled with the philosophical and historical implications of their master's account. None proved more influential in shaping subsequent interpretations than Aristotle, whose categorical dismissal of Atlantis as historical fact would echo through centuries of scholarly discourse. Aristotle's position on Atlantis emerged from his broader critique of Plato's philosophical methodology. As the most systematic and empirically minded of Plato's students, Aristotle possessed an acute sensitivity to the distinction between philosophical allegory and historical narrative. His famous declaration that the man who dreamed it up made it vanish represented more than casual skepticism. It reflected a fundamental disagreement about the proper relationship between philosophical instruction and factual accuracy. This terse dismissal, preserved in later sources, became the earliest recorded instance of scholarly skepticism toward the Atlantis account. The philosophical context surrounding Aristotle's rejection reveals deeper tensions within the Academy itself. Where Plato employed myth and allegory as vehicles for abstract truths, Aristotle increasingly favoured direct logical argument and empirical observation. The Atlantis narrative, with its precise numerical details and elaborate geographical descriptions, presented exactly the kind of fictional framework disguised as historical fact that Aristotle found methodologically problematic. His criticism targeted not merely the content of the story, but Plato's entire approach to philosophical pedagogy. Other immediate disciples of Plato adopted more nuanced positions. Crantor of Soli, who studied directly under Xenocrates in the early 3rd century BC, represented the first known attempt to defend the historical authenticity of the Atlantis account. His commentary on the Timaeus, fragments of which survive in later Neoplatonic sources, argued that Plato had indeed based his narrative on genuine Egyptian records. Crantor claimed to have verified the existence of these records during his own travels, though the specific nature of his evidence remains unclear from surviving fragments. The absence of Atlantis references in contemporary historical works presents one of the most compelling arguments for Aristotle's position. Herodotus, writing his histories in the mid-5th century BC, demonstrated exhaustive curiosity about distant lands and ancient civilizations. His accounts encompass regions from Scythia to Ethiopia, incorporating local traditions, religious practices, and historical memories spanning centuries. Yet nowhere in his comprehensive survey of the Mediterranean world and its periphery does Herodotus mention any tradition resembling the Atlantis story, despite his documented fascination with Egyptian wisdom and historical records. Similarly, Thucydides, whose History of the Peloponnesian War established new standards for historical accuracy and source criticism, makes no reference to any ancient Athenian victory over a Western maritime empire. Given Thucydides' meticulous attention to Athenian historical traditions and his pride in documenting the city's past achievements, this omission carries particular weight. His account of early Greek history, though brief, includes references to various ancient conflicts and migrations that would have provided natural contexts for mentioning the Atlantis War if such traditions had existed. The geographic writings of Strabo, composed during the early Roman Empire, provide perhaps the most systematic ancient critique of the Atlantis narrative. Writing around the time of Augustus, Strabo possessed access to extensive geographical literature from the Hellenistic period, including works by explorers who had ventured beyond the Pillars of Hercules into the Atlantic Ocean. His dismissal of Atlantis as Plato's invention carried the weight of comprehensive geographical knowledge unavailable to earlier critics. Strabo's analysis focused particularly on the practical impossibilities of Plato's geographical claims. The assertion that Atlantis had been larger than Libya and Asia combined struck him as fundamentally incompatible with what Hellenistic explorers had discovered about the Atlantic Ocean's extent and character. Furthermore, Strabo noted that Plato's claim about impassable mud shoals preventing later exploration contradicted the experiences of contemporary navigators who had successfully sailed Atlantic waters. His geographical expertise lent scientific credibility to philosophical skepticism about the account's historical accuracy. The Roman historical traditions similarly ignored the Atlantis narrative despite extensive engagement with Greek philosophical and historical sources. Livy's monumental Ab Urbe Condita incorporated numerous Greek historical traditions and legends, yet makes no reference to Atlantis, despite covering periods when such a story might have provided useful comparative material. Tacitus, renowned for his critical approach to sources and his interest in the relationship between geography and political power, likewise omits any mention of the lost civilization, despite his detailed discussions of distant lands and peoples. This pattern of omission becomes particularly significant when contrasted with the Roman treatment of other Platonic ideas. Roman intellectuals readily adopted and adapted Plato's political theories, educational philosophy, and metaphysical concepts. Yet the Atlantis narrative failed to gain traction in Roman historical or geographical literature, suggesting that educated Romans recognized its fictional character even when they embraced other aspects of Platonic thought. The rise of Neoplatonism during late antiquity marked a dramatic shift in the reception of the Atlantis narrative. Beginning with Plotinus in the 3rd century AD and reaching full development under Proclus in the 5th century, Neoplatonic philosophers approached Plato's works with a fundamentally different interpretive framework than their classical predecessors. Rather than viewing the dialogues primarily as philosophical arguments or historical accounts, they understood them as complex allegorical systems encoding profound metaphysical truths. Proclus, writing his extensive commentary on the Timaeus around 440 AD, devoted considerable attention to defending both the historical accuracy and allegorical significance of the Atlantis account. His approach reflected the Neoplatonic conviction that Plato's writings operated simultaneously on multiple levels of meaning. According to Proclus, the surface narrative of Atlantis described actual historical events, while the deeper allegorical structure revealed truths about the cosmic order and the soul's relationship to material existence. The Neoplatonic defense of Atlantis's historicity rested partly on theological arguments about divine providence and partly on elaborate theories about the relationship between time and eternity. Proclus argued that the Egyptian priests mentioned by Plato possessed genuine access to ancient records because their religious traditions maintained unbroken continuity with primordial wisdom. This continuity, guaranteed by divine providence, ensured the preservation of historical truth across millennia, despite the general tendency toward cultural decline and forgetfulness. More significantly, Proclus developed sophisticated allegorical interpretations that transformed the Atlantis narrative into a cosmic drama. In his reading, the conflict between Athens and Atlantis represented the eternal struggle between intellectual and material principles within both the cosmos and the individual soul. Ancient Athens embodied the philosophical life oriented toward eternal truths, while Atlantis symbolized the material world's seductive power and ultimate instability. The destruction of Atlantis thus illustrated the inevitable fate of any civilization that prioritized material prosperity over spiritual wisdom. These allegorical interpretations allowed Neoplatonic philosophers to embrace the Atlantis narrative without confronting the historical and geographical difficulties that had troubled earlier critics. By locating the story's primary significance in its symbolic rather than literal content, they could simultaneously affirm its truth and acknowledge its apparent incompatibility with known historical facts. This interpretive strategy proved influential among later medieval and Renaissance readers who inherited Neoplatonic approaches to Platonic texts. The encounter between the Atlantis narrative and early Christian thought produced complex and varied responses that reflected broader tensions between classical learning and biblical authority. Early Christian writers faced the challenge of integrating Greek philosophical wisdom with revealed truth while maintaining the primacy of scriptural chronology and historical framework. The Atlantis story presented particular difficulties because its ancient dating appeared to conflict with biblical accounts of human history and divine providence. Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 AD, demonstrated the sophisticated approach that characterized Alexandrian Christian scholarship. Rather than rejecting the Atlantis narrative outright, Clement sought to harmonize it with Christian historical understanding through careful chronological analysis. He argued that the Egyptian dating systems underlying Plato's account suffered from systematic errors that made ancient events appear far more remote than they actually were. By adjusting these chronologies to align with biblical timelines, Clement suggested that the Atlantis story might refer to events occurring within the framework of sacred history. Augustine of Hippo adopted a more skeptical stance that reflected his broader concerns about the relationship between classical learning and Christian faith. In his City of God, Augustine acknowledged the philosophical value of Platonic thought, while maintaining critical distance from specific historical claims that lacked scriptural support. His treatment of Atlantis exemplified this balanced approach, recognizing the story's allegorical potential while expressing doubt about its literal accuracy. The chronological problems posed by the Atlantis narrative became increasingly acute as Christian scholars developed more systematic approaches to universal history. The traditional dating of Atlantis to approximately 9,500 BC created obvious conflicts with biblical chronologies that placed human creation only a few millennia before the Christian era. Some Christian writers attempted to resolve this difficulty by arguing that Plato had misunderstood the Egyptian chronological systems, while others suggested that the story referred to antediluvian civilizations mentioned obliquely in Genesis. Eastern Christian writers, particularly those working within the Byzantine tradition, often proved more receptive to the Atlantis narrative than their Western counterparts. The Byzantine scholarly tradition maintained closer continuity with classical Greek learning and showed greater willingness to integrate non-biblical historical traditions into comprehensive historical frameworks. Some Byzantine chronographers attempted to incorporate the Atlantis story into their universal histories by identifying it with various biblical or post-biblical events. The patristic treatment of Atlantis also reflected broader theological concerns about divine justice and the fate of civilizations. Many Christian writers found in the destruction of Atlantis a powerful illustration of divine judgment against human pride and corruption. This theological interpretation allowed them to embrace the story's moral message, while remaining agnostic about its historical accuracy. The narrative's emphasis on the gradual moral decline of initially virtuous people resonated strongly with Christian understandings of human nature and the consequences of sin. The preservation and transmission of classical texts during the early medieval period significantly influenced later reception of the Atlantis narrative. As European scholars gradually recovered access to complete versions of Plato's dialogues, they encountered the story within its original philosophical context, rather than through the filtered interpretations of earlier commentators. This direct engagement with Plato's text would prove crucial for later medieval and Renaissance developments in Atlantis interpretation. The collapse of classical learning institutions across Western Europe during the 5th and 6th centuries created an intellectual vacuum that profoundly affected the transmission of Platonic texts. As barbarian invasions disrupted trade networks and urban centres, the elaborate manuscript copying operations that had sustained classical literature for centuries began to disintegrate. Monastic scriptoriums, while preserving essential Christian texts, operated with severely limited resources and necessarily selective copying priorities. In this environment of intellectual triage, the complete works of Plato, including the dialogues containing the Atlantis narrative, effectively vanished from Western European libraries. The practical challenges facing medieval scholars extended far beyond simple manuscript availability. The Timaeus and Critias dialogues required not only Greek linguistic competence, but also familiarity with complex philosophical concepts and classical geographical knowledge that had largely disappeared from European intellectual culture. Even when fragments of Platonic texts survived in monastic collections, they often existed as isolated passages divorced from their original context, making comprehensive interpretation nearly impossible. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries, despite its significant achievements in preserving and copying classical texts, failed to recover the complete Platonic corpus. Charlemagne's scholars, working primarily from Latin sources, had access to only limited portions of Plato's work through intermediary sources like Cicero's translations and Augustinian commentaries. The Timaeus existed in partial Latin translation through Chalcidius's 4th century version, but this translation ended abruptly at the point where Plato begins his detailed description of Atlantis, leaving medieval readers without access to the complete narrative. This textual gap created a peculiar situation where educated Europeans possessed theoretical knowledge about Plato's philosophical importance while remaining largely ignorant of his specific teachings. Medieval encyclopedists like Isidore of Seville acknowledge Plato's significance in their comprehensive surveys of classical learning, yet their discussions necessarily relied on second-hand summaries rather than direct textual engagement. The Atlantis narrative, requiring access to the complete Timaeus and Critias dialogues, remained effectively unknown to medieval scholarship. The few references to lost civilizations that appeared in medieval literature typically derived from biblical or patristic sources rather than classical Greek philosophy. Medieval chroniclers showed considerable interest in antediluvian history and the fate of pre-Christian civilizations, but their investigations drew primarily from Genesis, the Book of Enoch, and early Christian historical works. When medieval writers speculated about ancient catastrophes or vanished peoples, they framed their discussions within biblical chronology and theological interpretation rather than Platonic philosophy. The scholastic movement of the 12th and 13th centuries, despite its sophisticated engagement with classical philosophical texts, continued to lack access to the complete Platonic corpus. Thomas Aquinas, whose Summa Theologica demonstrated remarkable familiarity with Aristotelian philosophy, made only passing references to Platonic ideas and showed no knowledge of the Atlantis narrative. This omission becomes particularly significant given Aquinas' comprehensive approach to integrating classical philosophy with Christian doctrine. Had he possessed access to the complete Platonic texts, the Atlantis story would likely have received theological analysis similar to his treatment of other classical materials. The translation movement centered in medieval Spain, which brought numerous Arabic philosophical texts into Latin, also failed to recover the missing Platonic dialogues. Islamic scholars had preserved extensive Aristotelian materials and developed sophisticated commentaries on Greek philosophical works, but their libraries apparently lacked complete versions of the Timaeus and Critias. This absence suggests that the textual loss had occurred early enough to affect both Christian and Islamic manuscript traditions, pointing to disruptions in the immediate post-classical period rather than later medieval developments. Byzantine scholars maintained superior access to Greek philosophical texts throughout the medieval period, yet even their libraries appear to have suffered significant losses in Platonic materials. While Constantinople's scriptoriums preserved many classical works that disappeared from Western Europe, references to Atlantis remain notably absent from Byzantine historical and geographical literature. This pattern suggests that the textual disruption affected Greek-speaking regions as well as Latin Europe, indicating widespread damage to the manuscript tradition during the early medieval transition. The absence of Atlantis references in medieval literature becomes particularly striking when contrasted with the period's fascination with geographical speculation and legendary lands. Medieval writers displayed intense curiosity about distant regions, mythical islands, and lost civilizations, producing elaborate accounts of places like the Earthly Paradise, the Kingdom of Prester John, and various Atlantic islands reported by sailors. The intellectual appetite clearly existed for narratives like the Atlantis story, yet the specific Platonic account remained unavailable to satisfy this curiosity. The Renaissance transformation of European intellectual culture began with the gradual recovery of classical Greek texts through contact with Byzantine scholars and the systematic exploration of monastic libraries. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 accelerated this process by forcing Greek scholars westward, carrying with them manuscript collections that had survived in Eastern libraries. Among these recovered texts were complete versions of Plato's dialogues, including the Timaeus and Critias that contain the full Atlantis narrative. Marsilio Ficino's monumental Latin translation of Plato's complete works, completed in Florence around 1484, marked the decisive moment in the Atlantis narrative's return to European consciousness. Ficino, working under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, approached his translation project with both scholarly rigour and philosophical enthusiasm that reflected the broader Renaissance engagement with classical antiquity. His translation made Platonic texts accessible to educated Europeans for the first time in nearly a millennium, creating the foundation for renewed scholarly engagement with the Atlantis story. Ficino's interpretive approach to the Atlantis narrative reflected his deep commitment to Neoplatonic philosophy and his belief in the fundamental compatibility between Platonic wisdom and Christian truth. Rather than viewing the story as either pure fiction or literal history, Ficino understood it as a complex allegorical framework that encoded profound truths about human nature and divine providence. His commentary emphasized the moral dimensions of the narrative, interpreting the rise and fall of Atlantis as an illustration of the eternal conflict between spiritual and material values. The Medici court's intellectual environment proved particularly receptive to the Atlantis narrative's themes of lost wisdom and ancient greatness. Renaissance humanists, acutely conscious of their own civilization's relationship to classical antiquity, found in the Atlantis story a powerful metaphor for the recovery and loss of cultural achievement. The parallel between their own efforts to recover classical learning and Plato's account of ancient wisdom preserved in Egyptian temples resonated strongly with humanist sensibilities. Pico della Mirandola's engagement with the Atlantis narrative exemplified the Renaissance synthesis of classical philosophy, Christian theology, and esoteric wisdom traditions. His oration on the dignity of man reflected the same confidence in human potential that characterized Plato's description of early Atlantean civilization, while his warnings about the dangers of material excess echoed the moral decline that Plato attributed to later Atlantean generations. This thematic convergence helped establish the Atlantis story as a central reference point for Renaissance discussions about human nature and civilizational development. The printing revolution of the late 15th century dramatically expanded access to Ficino's Platonic translations, ensuring that the Atlantis narrative reached scholarly audiences throughout Europe. The 1491 Venetian edition of Ficino's translation, produced by Aldus Manutius, exemplified the new technology's capacity to disseminate classical texts with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Within decades, educated Europeans from London to Prague possessed access to complete versions of the Timaeus and Critias, ending the millennium-long absence of the Atlantis story from European intellectual discourse. The rediscovery of the Atlantis narrative coincided with the Age of Exploration's dramatic expansion of geographical knowledge, creating unprecedented opportunities for new interpretations of Plato's account. Columbus's voyages across the Atlantic Ocean, beginning in 1492, occurred within a decade of Ficino's translation project, establishing a remarkable chronological convergence between textual recovery and geographical exploration. This timing proved crucial for subsequent interpretations of the Atlantis narrative, as European scholars suddenly possessed both access to Plato's complete account and contemporary evidence of previously unknown lands beyond the Atlantic. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire provided particularly compelling material for Atlantis speculation. Hernán Cortés's letters describing Tenochtitlan's sophisticated urban planning, elaborate water management systems, and vast wealth immediately reminded educated Europeans of Plato's description of the Atlantean capital. The city's location on an island connected to the mainland by causeways, its complex system of canals and harbours, and its impressive architectural achievements all seem to echo specific details from the Critias dialogue. Francisco López de Gomara's Historia General de las Indias, published in 1552, made explicit connections between the newly discovered American civilizations and Plato's Atlantis narrative. López de Gomara argued that the advanced indigenous cultures encountered by Spanish conquistadors provided concrete evidence that sophisticated civilizations had indeed existed in the Atlantic region, lending credibility to Plato's account. His interpretation suggested that the Atlantis story preserved genuine historical memories of pre-Columbian American civilizations, transmitted through Egyptian records and ultimately recorded by Plato. The geographical location of the Americas relative to the Mediterranean world also seemed to support Platonic accuracy. The positioning of the New World beyond the Strait of Gibraltar corresponded precisely to Plato's description of Atlantis as lying beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The vast size of the American continents matched Plato's claim that Atlantis had been larger than Libya and Asia combined, while the Atlantic Ocean's extent provided ample space for the additional territories that Plato attributed to Atlantean control. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo's Historia Natural General de las Indias offered a more systematic analysis of parallels between Platonic descriptions and American realities. Oviedo, who spent decades in the New World documenting indigenous cultures and natural phenomena, identified numerous specific correspondences between Plato's account and observed American characteristics. He noted similarities in metallurgical techniques, agricultural practices, and architectural styles that suggested possible historical connections between Plato's Atlantis and pre-Columbian civilizations. The discovery of advanced hydraulic engineering in various American cultures provided particularly striking parallels to Plato's description of Atlantean water management, the elaborate canal systems of the Aztec capital, the sophisticated irrigation networks of Andean civilizations, and the complex harbour facilities found at various coastal sites all demonstrated engineering capabilities that matched or exceeded those attributed to Atlantis. These technological parallels suggested to Renaissance observers that American civilizations possessed the advanced knowledge that would have been necessary to construct the elaborate infrastructure described in the Critias. José de Acosta's Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias, published in 1590, attempted to provide a comprehensive framework for understanding the relationship between classical accounts of lost civilizations and contemporary American discoveries. Acosta argued that the Americas had been populated by successive waves of migration from the Old World, some of which might have carried memories of ancient civilizations that ultimately influenced indigenous American cultures. This migration theory provided a mechanism for explaining apparent parallels between Platonic descriptions and American realities without requiring direct historical continuity. The chronological difficulties posed by Plato's dating of Atlantis to approximately 9,500 BC created significant challenges for scholars attempting to connect the narrative with known American civilizations. Renaissance chronographers, working within biblical frameworks that placed human creation only a few millennia before the Christian era, struggled to accommodate Plato's ancient dating while maintaining the historical accuracy of scriptural accounts. Some scholars resolved this difficulty by arguing that Plato had misunderstood Egyptian chronological systems, while others suggested that the story referred to more recent events that had been artificially antiquated through oral transmission. The linguistic evidence presented by American discoveries also influenced Renaissance interpretations of the Atlantis narrative. Early ethnographers noted apparent similarities between certain American languages and Old World linguistic families, suggesting possible historical connections that might support Platonic claims about ancient Atlantic civilizations. While these linguistic parallels later proved largely illusory, They provided contemporary scholars with additional evidence for treating the Atlantis narrative as historically grounded rather than purely fictional. The intellectual ferment of the 17th and 18th centuries transformed European approaches to ancient texts and historical claims with unprecedented rigour. The scientific revolution's emphasis on empirical observation and systematic methodology created new frameworks for evaluating historical narratives, while expanding geographical knowledge provided fresh contexts for interpreting ancient accounts of distant lands. Within this transformed intellectual landscape, the Atlantis narrative encountered both vigorous scholarly investigation and increasingly sophisticated criticism, as Enlightenment thinkers applied emerging standards of evidence and reasoning to Plato's ancient account. The Swedish scholar Olof Rudbeck emerged as perhaps the most ambitious and systematic proponent of Atlantis theories during this period. His monumental work Atland eller Mannheim, published in 4 volumes between 1679 and 1702, represented an extraordinary attempt to relocate Plato's lost civilization within the familiar geography of Scandinavia. Rudbeck, who held the chair of medicine at Uppsala University and possessed extensive knowledge of Nordic archaeology and linguistics, developed an elaborate theory identifying Sweden as the original Atlantis described by Plato. Rudbeck's identification of Sweden with Atlantis rested on a complex philological argument that traced the name Atlantis through various linguistic transformations to Atland, which he interpreted as an ancient designation for Swedish territory. He argued that classical authors had systematically misunderstood the geographical references in ancient sources, placing Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean when the original accounts actually referred to the Baltic Sea region. According to Rudbeck's reconstruction, the Pillars of Hercules mentioned by Plato did not refer to the Strait of Gibraltar, but rather to some northern geographical feature, possibly the narrow passages between Danish islands or the entrance to the Baltic Sea itself. The archaeological evidence that Rudbeck marshalled in support of his theory reflected the limited but growing knowledge of Scandinavian prehistory available in the late 17th century. He pointed to the numerous Bronze Age burial mounds scattered across the Swedish landscape as evidence of an ancient civilization of extraordinary sophistication and wealth. The elaborate grave goods discovered in these burials, including intricate metalwork and imported materials from distant regions, suggested to Rudbeck a level of cultural development and international trade connections that matched Plato's descriptions of Atlantean prosperity and influence. Rudbeck's linguistic analysis extended beyond simple etymological connections to encompass a comprehensive theory about the relationship between ancient Swedish and classical languages. He argued that many fundamental terms in Greek and Latin actually derived from Proto-Germanic roots preserved in Swedish, suggesting that Scandinavian civilization had provided the foundation for classical Mediterranean cultures rather than the reverse. This linguistic priority, according to Rudbeck, explained how ancient Swedish traditions about their own glorious past had eventually reached Egyptian priests and ultimately influenced Plato's account. The geographical features of Sweden and its surrounding regions provided Rudbeck with numerous parallels to Plato's description of Atlantis. The complex archipelago systems along Sweden's eastern coast, with their intricate patterns of islands, straits and sheltered harbours, seem to echo the concentric rings of land and water that Plato attributed to the Atlantean capital. The extensive lake systems of central Sweden, connected by rivers and navigable waterways, offered a plausible model for the elaborate canal networks that Plato described as facilitating both transportation and irrigation throughout Atlantean territory. Rudbeck's reconstruction of ancient Swedish climate and geography relied heavily on his understanding of post-glacial geological processes, which represented cutting-edge scientific knowledge for his era. He argued that the Baltic Sea region had undergone dramatic changes since ancient times, with land elevation and sea level fluctuations transforming the geographical relationships between land and water. These changes, according to Rudbeck, explained why contemporary Scandinavia no longer matched Plato's descriptions exactly while preserving enough similarities to reveal the underlying correspondence. The political implications of Rudbeck's theory extended far beyond academic scholarship to encompass questions of national identity and cultural prestige that resonated powerfully in 17th century Sweden. The Swedish Empire under Charles XI had reached unprecedented territorial extent, controlling much of the Baltic region and asserting influence throughout northern Europe. Rudbeck's identification of Sweden as the original Atlantis provided historical justification for Swedish political dominance while establishing the cultural superiority of Nordic civilization over classical Mediterranean traditions. Contemporary critics of Rudbeck's theory focus primarily on his philological methods and geographical assumptions, rather than challenging his archaeological evidence directly. The German scholar Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, despite his general admiration for Rudbeck's erudition, expressed skepticism about the linguistic connections that formed the foundation of the Swedish scholar's argument. Leibniz noted that similar etymological methods could be used to connect virtually any modern language with ancient terms, making such arguments inherently unreliable without independent corroborating evidence. The broader intellectual context of late 17th century scholarship provided both support and challenges for Rudbeck's approach to ancient texts. The emerging discipline of comparative linguistics had begun to reveal genuine historical relationships between different language families, lending credibility to arguments based on philological analysis. However, the systematic methods that would later characterize historical linguistics remained undeveloped, allowing scholars considerable latitude in proposing etymological connections that later investigation would prove unfounded. French scholars of the early 18th century developed alternative approaches to the Atlantis narrative that reflected their nation's growing involvement in global exploration and colonial expansion. The mathematician and geographer Philippe Boitier proposed in 1737 that Atlantis had been located in the North Atlantic region, possibly corresponding to submerged land masses between Europe and North America. Boitier's theory drew on emerging oceanographic knowledge and geological speculation about past changes in sea level, representing an early attempt to apply scientific reasoning to the geographical aspects of Plato's account. Boitier's cartographic work provided visual representation of his theories through detailed maps showing hypothetical Atlantic land masses that might have existed in ancient times. His Carte physique et politique de l'Atlantique depicted a series of islands and shallow areas that could plausibly have supported the large population and extensive territories that Plato attributed to Atlantis. The map incorporated contemporary knowledge about ocean depths and underwater topography, while extrapolating possible ancient configurations based on geological theories about crustal movement and sea level change. The influence of emerging geological knowledge on Atlantis theories became increasingly significant throughout the 18th century, as scholars developed more sophisticated understanding of Earth's physical processes. The recognition that sea levels had changed dramatically over geological time provided a plausible mechanism for explaining how large land masses might have disappeared beneath ocean waters. The discovery of marine fossils in mountain regions demonstrated that current geographical relationships between land and sea differed significantly from past configurations, lending credibility to claims about vanished continents. Voltaire's treatment of the Atlantis narrative in his Essai sur les mœurs exemplified the Enlightenment's critical approach to ancient authorities and historical claims. Rather than accepting Plato's account at face value or attempting to identify specific geographical locations for Atlantis, Voltaire subjected the narrative to systematic rational analysis that revealed numerous internal inconsistencies and implausibilities. His critique focused particularly on the chronological problems posed by Plato's dating and the absence of corroborating evidence from other ancient sources. The methodological innovations of 18th century historiography provided new tools for evaluating ancient texts that fundamentally changed scholarly approaches to narratives like Atlantis. Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire demonstrated how careful source criticism and systematic comparison of different accounts could reveal the historical accuracy or inaccuracy of ancient claims. These methods, when applied to the Atlantis narrative, highlighted the unique character of Plato's account and its isolation from other ancient historical traditions. The expansion of European knowledge about Pacific Ocean geography through the voyages of James Cook and other explorers provided fresh contexts for interpreting ancient accounts of distant lands. The discovery of sophisticated Polynesian civilizations scattered across vast oceanic distances demonstrated that advanced cultures could indeed exist on remote islands, lending some credibility to claims about ancient Atlantic civilizations. However, the absence of any archaeological evidence for large-scale civilization in the Atlantic region contrasted sharply with the abundant material remains of Pacific Island cultures. German scholars of the mid-18th century developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to ancient mythology and historical narratives that influenced interpretations of the Atlantis story. Johann David Michaelis's work on biblical chronology and ancient Near Eastern history provided methodological frameworks for evaluating claims about ancient civilizations and their historical relationships. His emphasis on linguistic evidence and comparative cultural analysis offered alternatives to the purely geographical approaches that had dominated earlier Atlantis speculation. The emergence of systematic archaeology during the later 18th century began to provide concrete evidence about ancient civilizations that could be compared with Plato's descriptions of Atlantis. The excavation of Pompeii and Herculaneum revealed the material culture of ancient urban civilizations with unprecedented detail, allowing scholars to evaluate the plausibility of Plato's claims about Atlantean technology and social organization. The absence of archaeological evidence for comparably advanced ancient civilizations in Atlantic regions became increasingly problematic for theories supporting the historical accuracy of Plato's account. The philosophical implications of Atlantis theories also received increased attention during the Enlightenment, as scholars grappled with questions about the relationship between historical truth and moral instruction. David Hume's analysis of testimony and evidence in his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding provided frameworks for evaluating extraordinary historical claims that could be applied to narratives like Atlantis. His emphasis on the inherent improbability of miraculous or extraordinary events challenged scholars to provide exceptional evidence for exceptional claims about ancient civilizations. The development of comparative mythology during the later 18th century offered new interpretive frameworks for understanding narratives about lost civilizations and ancient catastrophes. Scholars began to recognize similar patterns in flood myths and accounts of vanished peoples across different cultures, suggesting that such narratives might preserve distorted memories of actual historical events rather than representing pure fiction. This approach allowed for more nuanced interpretations of the Atlantis story that acknowledged both its mythological character and its possible historical foundations. The influence of Enlightenment rationalism on Atlantis interpretation produced increasingly sophisticated attempts to separate the story's potentially historical elements from its obviously fictional elaborations. Some scholars argued that Plato might have based his account on genuine historical traditions about ancient Mediterranean civilizations, while adding fictional details to serve his philosophical purposes. This approach required careful analysis of which aspects of the narrative seemed most historically plausible and which appeared to serve primarily literary or allegorical functions. The growing body of ethnographic knowledge about non-European civilizations provided additional contexts for evaluating Plato's descriptions of Atlantean society and culture. Reports from European travellers and missionaries about complex political systems, sophisticated technologies, and elaborate religious practices among various indigenous peoples demonstrated that the social features attributed to Atlantis were not inherently implausible. However, the absence of any contemporary civilization matching the specific combination of characteristics described by Plato continue to challenge theories supporting the account's historical accuracy. The publication of Atlantis, the Antediluvian World in 1882 marked a seismic shift in how the Western world understood and interpreted Plato's ancient narrative. Ignatius Donnelly, a charismatic former congressman from Minnesota, with no formal training in archaeology or ancient history, produced a work that would fundamentally reshape popular conceptions of human prehistory and establish enduring mythologies about lost civilizations that persist to this day. His 500-page tome, dense with citations, maps, and comparative analyses, presented itself as rigorous scholarship while advancing theories that professional archaeologists and historians found deeply problematic. Donnelly's background as a populist politician rather than an academic scholar profoundly influenced his approach to the Atlantis question. Born in Philadelphia in 1831, he had built his career on challenging established authorities and championing the common man against entrenched elites. His political experience in Minnesota territorial politics and his 3 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives had honed his skills in persuasive rhetoric and popular communication. When he turned his attention to ancient history, he brought the same combative spirit and populist sensibilities that had characterized his political career, positioning himself as a truth-telling outsider challenging the dogmas of academic establishments. The intellectual climate of the 1880s provided fertile ground for Donnelly's revolutionary claims about human prehistory. Charles Darwin's Origin of Species had fundamentally altered scientific understanding of human development, while archaeological discoveries across Europe, Egypt, and the Americas were revealing evidence of sophisticated ancient civilizations that challenged traditional biblical chronologies. The general public, educated enough to follow scientific developments but lacking specialized knowledge to evaluate competing claims, proved remarkably receptive to bold new theories that promised to explain mysterious archaeological phenomena and ancient myths within comprehensive theoretical frameworks. Donnelly's central thesis rested on the proposition that Plato's Atlantis had been a real historical civilization whose destruction approximately 11,000 years ago had scattered survivors across the globe, carrying advanced knowledge and cultural practices that became the foundation for all subsequent human civilizations. This catastrophic dispersal, according to Donnelly, explained the remarkable similarities he claimed to observe between ancient cultures separated by vast geographical distances. Rather than viewing these similarities as evidence of independent human development or later cultural contact, Donnelly argued they represented the fragmentary preservation of a common Atlantean heritage. The methodological approach that Donnelly employed in constructing his argument combined selective citation of legitimate archaeological and ethnographic sources with speculative interpretations that extended far beyond what the evidence could reasonably support. He demonstrated remarkable industry in gathering comparative material from diverse cultures, citing everything from Aztec creation myths to Egyptian pyramid construction techniques to Celtic folklore. However, his analysis consistently emphasized superficial similarities while ignoring fundamental differences, and he showed little concern for the chronological contexts that would have been essential for establishing actual historical connections. Donnelly's treatment of flood myths provided a representative example of his methodology. He compiled extensive lists of flood narratives from cultures around the world, noting apparent similarities in their descriptions of worldwide catastrophes that destroyed earlier civilizations. From these parallels, he argued that all flood myths preserve distorted memories of the actual destruction of Atlantis, transmitted through oral traditions by scattered survivors. This interpretation allowed him to treat diverse mythological traditions as corroborating historical evidence, while dismissing the obvious differences between various flood narratives as minor corruptions introduced during centuries of oral transmission. The linguistic evidence that Donnelly marshalled in support of his theories reflected both the strengths and weaknesses of 19th century comparative philology. He identified numerous words from different language families that appeared to share common roots, arguing that these similarities demonstrated descent from a common Atlantean linguistic ancestor. His etymological analyses ranged from plausible connections between related Indo-European languages to wildly speculative derivations that linked unrelated linguistic families through chains of hypothetical sound changes. Professional linguists recognized that Donnelly's methods could be used to prove virtually any desired linguistic relationship, making his conclusions essentially meaningless from a scholarly perspective. The architectural parallels that formed another pillar of Donnelly's argument drew on the growing body of archaeological knowledge about ancient construction techniques and monumental buildings. He noted that cultures as diverse as the ancient Egyptians, Mesoamerican civilizations, and various European megalithic builders had all constructed massive stone structures using sophisticated engineering techniques. These similarities, according to Donnelly, could only be explained by assuming that all these cultures had inherited their architectural knowledge from Atlantean colonists who had escaped the Great Catastrophe. Donnelly's analysis of pyramid construction proved particularly influential in establishing lasting Atlantis mythologies. He argued that the mathematical precision evident in Egyptian pyramids, combined with similar structures found in Mexico and other regions, demonstrated the global spread of advanced Atlantean knowledge. His calculations of pyramid dimensions and astronomical alignments, while often mathematically accurate, extended into speculative interpretations about encoded ancient wisdom that went far beyond what the archaeological evidence could support. The popular fascination with pyramid mysteries that his work helped establish would influence subsequent generations of alternative historians and conspiracy theorists. The metallurgical evidence that Donnelly cited reflected genuine archaeological discoveries about ancient metalworking techniques that had impressed contemporary scholars. The sophisticated bronze and iron technologies found in various ancient cultures, combined with evidence of extensive trade networks that had distributed metals across vast distances, suggested to Donnelly a level of technological coordination that required centralized direction from an advanced mother civilization. His interpretation ignored the well-documented gradual development of metallurgical techniques through cultural contact and technological innovation, instead attributing all advances to Atlantean inheritance. The botanical and zoological arguments that Donnelly advanced demonstrated both his wide reading in contemporary scientific literature and his tendency to extend legitimate observations into unsupported theoretical frameworks. He noted that many cultivated plants and domesticated animals appeared to have been developed simultaneously in different regions of the world, suggesting to him coordinated agricultural development directed by Atlantean colonists. His analysis ignored the extensive scholarly work on plant and animal domestication that had already demonstrated independent development in different regions, instead interpreting all agricultural similarities as evidence of common Atlantean origin. The religious and mythological parallels that Donnelly identified formed perhaps the most emotionally compelling aspect of his argument for contemporary readers. He compiled extensive catalogues of similar creation myths, hero legends, and religious practices from cultures around the world, arguing that these similarities demonstrated the global influence of Atlantean religious traditions. His analysis of flood myths, creation stories, and tales of culture-bearing gods arriving from across the sea resonated powerfully with readers familiar with biblical narratives and classical mythology, providing a framework that seemed to unify diverse religious traditions within a single historical explanation. The impact of Donnelly's work on popular consciousness proved immediate and profound, transforming Atlantis from an obscure philosophical dialogue into a central reference point for discussions about human prehistory and lost civilizations. The book's commercial success was extraordinary for a work of purported scholarship, going through multiple editions and translations that brought Donnelly's theories to readers across Europe and America. Public lectures based on the book drew large audiences eager to hear about the dramatic revelations that promised to revolutionize understanding of human history. The Victorian context that made Donnelly's theories particularly appealing reflected broader cultural anxieties and aspirations that characterized the late 19th century. The rapid pace of technological change and imperial expansion had created unprecedented awareness of human potential, while simultaneously raising questions about the permanence of civilizational achievements. Donnelly's narrative of a great civilization destroyed by natural catastrophe spoke to contemporary fears about the fragility of progress, while his emphasis on the global spread of Atlantean knowledge appealed to Victorian confidence in the civilizing mission of advanced cultures. The racial implications of Donnelly's theories, while often implicit rather than explicitly stated, reflected the racial hierarchies and evolutionary assumptions that characterized Victorian anthropological thinking. His argument that all human civilizational achievements ultimately derived from Atlantean sources suggested that contemporary primitive peoples represented degraded remnants of once advanced cultures rather than examples of earlier evolutionary stages. This interpretation allowed Victorian readers to maintain beliefs in racial hierarchy while acknowledging the sophisticated achievements of non-European cultures that archaeological discoveries were revealing. The influence of Donnelly's work on subsequent Atlantis researchers proved both extensive and lasting, establishing interpretive frameworks and evidentiary standards that would characterize alternative archaeology for generations. His emphasis on comparative methodology, while methodologically flawed, provided a template that later writers would follow in developing their own theories about ancient civilizations. The specific parallels he identified between different cultures became standard reference points for subsequent Atlantis literature, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of citation that gave his arguments apparent scholarly support. The professional archaeological community's response to Donnelly's work reflected the growing tensions between academic specialists and popular writers that would characterize debates about ancient history throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While some scholars acknowledged Donnelly's industry in gathering comparative material, they uniformly rejected his theoretical framework and interpretive methods. The absence of archaeological evidence for any advanced civilization in the Atlantic region during the time period Donnelly proposed remained a fundamental obstacle to accepting his theories, regardless of the superficial parallels he identified between different cultures. The establishment of specific Atlantis tropes through Donnelly's work created lasting influences on popular culture and alternative historical thinking that extended far beyond scholarly debates. His emphasis on advanced ancient technology, global catastrophic destruction, and the preservation of secret knowledge by survivor populations became standard elements in subsequent lost civilization narratives. The specific details he provided about Atlantean society, technology, and global influence became canonical references that later writers would elaborate and modify while maintaining the basic framework he'd established. The methodological innovations that Donnelly introduced, despite their scholarly limitations, demonstrated new possibilities for synthesizing diverse sources of information in support of comprehensive historical theories. His use of comparative analysis, while often superficial and selective, showed how apparent patterns across different cultures could be marshalled as evidence for historical claims. The visual presentation of his arguments through maps, charts, and illustrations provided models for subsequent popular historical writing that emphasized accessibility and dramatic impact over scholarly rigor. The lasting appeal of Donnelly's theories reflected deeper human needs for comprehensive explanations of historical mysteries and cultural similarities that conventional academic approaches seemed unable to satisfy. His narrative provided satisfying answers to questions about the origins of civilization, the meaning of ancient myths, and the connections between geographically separated cultures that resonated with readers seeking alternatives to fragmented specialist knowledge. The emotional satisfaction of his grand, unified theory of human prehistory proved more compelling to general audiences than the cautious, provisional conclusions that characterize professional archaeological scholarship. The transformation of Atlantis from Donnelly's pseudo-archaeological construct into a cornerstone of modern occult doctrine began with Helena Petrovna Blavatsky's ambitious synthesis of Eastern philosophy, Western esotericism, and speculative anthropology in the 1880s. Blavatsky, a Russian aristocrat turned spiritual teacher, possessed an extraordinary talent for weaving together disparate religious and philosophical traditions into comprehensive cosmological systems that promised to reveal hidden truths about human spiritual evolution. Her monumental work, The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, elevated Atlantis from a lost civilization into a crucial stage in humanity's cosmic development, establishing interpretive frameworks that would influence esoteric thought for more than a century. Blavatsky's approach to Atlantis differed fundamentally from Donnelly's archaeological methodology, drawing instead on claimed access to ancient wisdom preserved in Tibetan monasteries and transmitted through psychic revelation. She asserted that her teachings derived from the Akashic records, a cosmic repository of all human experience accessible through advanced spiritual development, and from direct communication with Mahatmas, ascended masters who guided human evolution from hidden retreats in the Himalayas. This claimed supernatural authority allowed her to present detailed accounts of Atlantean civilization without relying on conventional historical evidence, positioning her revelations as superior to both academic scholarship and popular speculation. The doctrine of root races formed the theoretical foundation of Blavatsky's Atlantis teachings, providing a framework that connected individual spiritual development with cosmic evolutionary cycles. According to theosophical cosmology, humanity progressed through 7 distinct root races, each representing a different stage of physical and spiritual evolution occurring over millions of years. The 4th root race, known as the Atlanteans, had inhabited the Earth during a period when the planet's geography, climate, and spiritual conditions differed dramatically from contemporary circumstances. These beings possessed physical and psychic capabilities that modern humans had largely lost, representing both an evolutionary peak and a cautionary example of spiritual failure. The Atlantean root race, as described in theosophical literature, encompass several sub-races that develop different characteristics and capabilities over millions of years. The earliest Atlanteans were giants possessing natural psychic powers, direct communion with spiritual hierarchies, and technological capabilities that operated through spiritual rather than mechanical principles. Their civilization reached heights of material and spiritual achievement that surpassed anything known to recorded history, with cities of crystalline beauty, flying vehicles powered by spiritual energy, and social systems based on direct psychic communication between individuals and governing councils. Blavatsky's description of Atlantean technology emphasized its integration with spiritual principles rather than mechanical engineering. The Atlanteans supposedly powered their vehicles and machinery through manipulation of subtle energies that modern science had not yet discovered, using crystals and sound vibrations to achieve effects that contemporary technology accomplished through crude mechanical means. Their architecture incorporated sacred geometry and harmonic principles that created buildings serving simultaneously as functional spaces and spiritual instruments, with temples that could amplify psychic abilities and facilitate communication with higher spiritual planes. The social organization of Atlantean civilization, according to theosophical teachings, reflected the advanced spiritual development of its inhabitants during the race's early periods. Natural psychic abilities eliminated the need for complex governmental bureaucracies, as individuals could communicate directly with qualified leaders and participate in collective decision-making through telepathic consensus. The absence of deception and hidden motives in a psychically transparent society created social harmony that modern civilizations, dependent on external laws and enforcement mechanisms, could barely comprehend. The spiritual practices of the Atlanteans involved direct participation in cosmic processes that later civilizations could only approach through symbolic rituals and philosophical speculation. They maintained conscious contact with the spiritual hierarchies guiding planetary evolution, receiving direct instruction in the laws governing matter and energy manipulation. Their religious ceremonies were functional working sessions that actually affected physical and spiritual conditions rather than symbolic representations of abstract theological concepts, making their priests simultaneously scientists, engineers, and spiritual teachers. The decline and destruction of Atlantean civilization provided Blavatsky with a powerful illustration of the consequences of spiritual degeneracy and the misuse of occult knowledge. As the root race progressed through its evolutionary cycle, later generations gradually lost their natural spiritual abilities while retaining dangerous technological capabilities. The integration of spiritual and material power that had characterized early Atlantean civilization gave way to the separation of these domains, with a priestly class hoarding occult knowledge, while political leaders pursued material ambitions divorced from spiritual wisdom. The practice of black magic emerged during Atlantis' declining period, as individuals and groups began using spiritual knowledge for selfish purposes rather than cosmic service. The same psychic abilities and energy manipulation techniques that had created Atlantean civilization's golden age became tools for personal aggrandizement and the domination of others. Secret societies developed within Atlantean society, preserving dangerous occult practices while corrupting the spiritual teachings that had originally guided the race's development. The final destruction of Atlantis occurred through a combination of natural catastrophes and the consequences of spiritual corruption, according to theosophical accounts. The misuse of spiritual forces had disrupted the subtle energy patterns maintaining the continent's physical stability, while the accumulation of negative karma from black magic practices had attracted destructive cosmic influences. The great cataclysm that sank Atlantis beneath the ocean represented both a natural geological process and a spiritual cleansing that removed a corrupted civilization whose continued existence would have hindered planetary evolution. The survivors of Atlantis' destruction carried both beneficial knowledge and dangerous corruptions to other parts of the world, establishing the foundation for subsequent civilizations while perpetuating the spiritual conflicts that had destroyed their homeland. Some Atlantean refugees preserved authentic spiritual teachings and became the founders of ancient mystery schools in Egypt, India, and other regions where esoteric knowledge continued to be transmitted through initiated lineages. Other survivors brought corrupted practices and became the source of black magic traditions that continue to threaten human spiritual development throughout history, The influence of Atlantean karma on subsequent human evolution explained, according to theosophical doctrine, many of the spiritual and social problems affecting modern civilization. The same souls who had participated in Atlantis' rise and fall were reincarnating in contemporary times, bringing both advanced capabilities and unresolved spiritual conflicts from their previous existence. The technological achievements of the modern era represented a partial recovery of Atlantean abilities, but without the spiritual wisdom necessary to use these powers constructively, humanity risked repeating the same destructive patterns that had led to Atlantis' downfall. Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophical interpretation of Atlantis built upon theosophical foundations, while developing distinctive approaches to spiritual evolution and human development that reflected his background in German idealist philosophy and his personal clairvoyant investigations. Steiner, who had initially been associated with the Theosophical Society before founding his own Anthroposophical Society in 1913, claimed direct spiritual perception of Atlantean civilization through developed supersensible faculties that allowed him to investigate past evolutionary periods with scientific precision. Steiner's account of Atlantean civilization emphasized the fundamental differences between ancient and modern consciousness that made direct comparison between these periods problematic. According to anthroposophical teachings, the Atlanteans possessed a dreamlike consciousness that provided direct access to spiritual realities but lacked the sharp intellectual discrimination that characterized post-Atlantean thinking. Their perception of the physical world remained fluid and malleable, allowing them to work with natural forces in ways that modern consciousness, fixed in rigid conceptual frameworks, could no longer achieve. The educational methods employed in Atlantean civilization reflected their different relationship to knowledge and learning, according to Steiner's investigations. Rather than acquiring information through external instruction, Atlanteans developed their capabilities through direct participation in cosmic processes guided by advanced teachers who possessed full spiritual vision. The development of individual faculties occurred through graduated exposure to spiritual influences that awakened dormant capacities rather than through the accumulation of conceptual knowledge that characterized later educational approaches. The agricultural and technological practices of the Atlanteans operated through their ability to work directly with the life forces animating plants, animals, and natural processes. They could stimulate plant growth, direct animal behavior, and manipulate weather patterns through spiritual influence, rather than mechanical intervention. Their tools and machines functioned as extensions of human will and spiritual energy rather than as independent mechanical devices, creating a technology that was simultaneously more advanced and more harmoniously integrated with natural processes than modern industrial methods. The social institutions of Atlantean civilization reflected their natural spiritual hierarchy based on actual levels of spiritual development rather than external social conventions. Leadership positions were occupied by individuals whose advanced spiritual faculties qualified them to perceive the needs of the community and the requirements of evolutionary development. The absence of democratic political processes reflected not authoritarian oppression, but the natural recognition of spiritual authority by those with less developed capacities. The mystery centers that flourished during Atlantis' later periods served as bridges between the ancient dream consciousness and the emerging intellectual awareness that would characterize post-Atlantean civilization. These institutions provided controlled environments where selected individuals could develop new forms of consciousness while maintaining connection to the spiritual realities that Atlantean culture had naturally accessed. The initiation practices developed in these centers became the foundation for the mystery schools that preserved spiritual knowledge throughout subsequent historical periods. The catastrophic end of Atlantean civilization represented a necessary evolutionary transition rather than simply a punishment for spiritual corruption, according to Steiner's interpretation. The dream consciousness that had enabled Atlantean achievements had become an obstacle to further human development, preventing the emergence of individual freedom and moral responsibility that required clear intellectual discrimination. The destruction of Atlantis allowed human evolution to proceed toward the development of ego consciousness and independent thinking that would eventually enable individuals to freely choose their spiritual development. The post-Atlantean cultural epochs described by Steiner traced the gradual recovery and transformation of Atlantean capabilities through different approaches to spiritual and material development. The ancient Indian epoch emphasized withdrawal from material existence to preserve direct spiritual perception, while the Persian period began the process of spiritualizing material work. The Egyptian Chaldean epoch developed the intellectual and technical capabilities necessary for manipulating physical forces, leading eventually to the Greek-Roman period's achievement of individual personality development. Edgar Cayce's psychic readings about Atlantis, delivered during trance states between 1923 and 1944, provided the most detailed and influential modern account of the lost civilization while establishing interpretive frameworks that would dominate New Age approaches to ancient mysteries. Cayce, a photographer from Kentucky with no formal education in history or archaeology, claimed to access information about past lives and historical events through psychic means while in an unconscious state. His 14,000 documented readings included over 700 references to Atlantis, creating a comprehensive narrative that combined theosophical concepts with distinctive American metaphysical traditions. The Atlantean civilization described in Cayce's readings spanned a period from approximately 200,000 to 10,000 BC, encompassing multiple technological and spiritual developments that occurred over vast time periods. According to these psychic revelations, Atlantis had experienced 3 major periods of destruction caused by the misuse of advanced technology, with the final cataclysm around 10,500 BC completely submerging the continent beneath the Atlantic Ocean. The survivors of these destructions had migrated to various parts of the world, carrying Atlantean knowledge and establishing the foundations for ancient Egyptian, Mayan, and other advanced civilizations. The technology attributed to Atlantis in Cayce's readings centered on the use of crystals for generating and focusing various forms of energy that could power vehicles, provide illumination, and facilitate long-distance communication. The great crystal that served as the primary power source for Atlantean civilization was described as a massive stone capable of concentrating solar and cosmic energies for practical applications. The misuse of this crystal technology by later generations, who turned it toward destructive purposes and personal aggrandizement, ultimately caused the geological instabilities that led to the continent's destruction. The social organization of Atlantis, according to Cayce's readings, involved a complex mixture of highly advanced spiritual beings and more primitive human types who coexisted in relationships that sometimes created conflict and exploitation. The Sons of the Law of One represented the spiritually advanced faction that sought to use Atlantean technology for constructive purposes and the elevation of all consciousness, while the Sons of Belial pursued selfish material goals and the exploitation of less developed beings for personal benefit. The increasing dominance of the Sons of Belial during Atlantis' later periods created the spiritual conditions that attracted the final catastrophic destruction. The reincarnation patterns described in Cayce's readings suggested that many souls who had lived in Atlantis were returning to incarnation during the 20th century, bringing both advanced capabilities and unresolved karmic patterns from their previous existence. These returning Atlantean souls were said to possess natural abilities in technology, healing, and spiritual development that could contribute to human progress, but they also carried tendencies toward the misuse of power and the pursuit of material goals that had characterized Atlantis' decline. The influence of Casey's Atlantis readings on 20th century New Age movements proved profound and lasting, providing a mythological framework that connected ancient wisdom with contemporary spiritual seeking while offering hope for the recovery of lost human capabilities. The emphasis on crystal technology resonated with New Age interests in alternative healing and energy work, while the reincarnation themes provided explanations for individual spiritual experiences and capabilities that seemed to transcend ordinary human limitations. The archaeological predictions contained in Casey's readings, including claims about the future discovery of Atlantean records in Egypt and the Bahamas, created ongoing expectations among his followers that physical evidence would eventually validate his psychic revelations. The identification of specific locations where Atlantean artifacts and records were supposedly preserved, including chambers beneath the Sphinx and temple complexes in the Caribbean region, provided focal points for continued investigation and speculation that extended far beyond Casey's death in 1945. The transformation of Atlantis from Plato's philosophical allegory into a spiritual teaching tool reflected broader changes in Western religious and intellectual culture during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The decline of traditional Christian authority, combined with increased awareness of Eastern religions and the emergence of modern psychology, created cultural space for alternative spiritual systems that promised direct access to higher knowledge and personal transformation. Atlantis provided an ideal vehicle for these aspirations, offering a historical precedent for human spiritual capabilities while explaining the apparent loss of these abilities through comprehensible narrative frameworks. The occult interpretation of Atlantis also served important psychological functions for individuals seeking meaning and identity within rapidly changing modern societies. The claim of Atlantean past lives provided explanations for feelings of alienation from contemporary culture, while suggesting that individuals possessed hidden capabilities that transcended ordinary human limitations. The narrative of spiritual decline and potential recovery offered hope for personal and collective transformation that resonated with both individual spiritual seeking and broader social reform movements. The integration of Atlantis themes into various occult and New Age movements created self-reinforcing belief systems that generated their own evidence through psychic revelations, channeled communications, and interpretive frameworks that could accommodate virtually any anomalous experience or archaeological discovery. The absence of conventional historical evidence for Atlantis became, within these systems, additional proof of the conspiracy of materialistic science to suppress spiritual truths that threatened established authorities and conventional worldviews. The systematic application of modern scientific methodology to Atlantis claims began in earnest during the early 20th century, as professional archaeology established rigorous standards for evidence evaluation and peer review processes that would fundamentally challenge the speculative theories that had flourished during the Victorian era. The development of stratigraphic excavation techniques, radiocarbon dating methods, and comparative archaeological analysis provided tools for investigating ancient civilizations with unprecedented precision, creating opportunities to test the various claims about Atlantean influence on known historical cultures while simultaneously revealing the absence of evidence for any advanced Atlantic civilization during the periods proposed by different theorists. The archaeological investigation of Mediterranean Bronze Age civilizations during the first half of the 20th century produced discoveries that initially seemed to support some aspects of Atlantis theories, while ultimately demonstrating the dangers of superficial historical parallels. The excavation of Minoan palaces on Crete by Sir Arthur Evans, beginning in 1900, revealed a sophisticated civilization that had flourished during the second millennium BC, possessing advanced hydraulic engineering, elaborate artistic traditions, and extensive maritime trade networks that connected the Aegean world with Egypt, Anatolia, and the Western Mediterranean. The sudden collapse of Minoan civilization around 1450 BC, apparently caused by natural disasters combined with foreign invasion, provided a historical precedent for the kind of catastrophic civilizational destruction described in Plato's account. Evans himself initially drew explicit parallels between Minoan Crete and Plato's Atlantis, noting similarities in their island locations, maritime orientations, advanced technologies, and sudden destruction. The Minoan palaces at Knossos and Phaistos featured elaborate water management systems, including indoor plumbing, drainage networks, and decorative fountains that seemed to echo Plato's descriptions of Atlantean hydraulic engineering. The extensive storage facilities for oil, wine, and grain suggested the kind of agricultural abundance that Plato attributed to Atlantis, while the evidence for long-distance trade in luxury goods indicated the wealth and international connections that characterized Plato's lost civilization. The artistic representations found in Minoan palaces provided additional apparent parallels to Atlantean themes, including frescoes depicting bull-leaping ceremonies that seemed to correspond to Plato's account of ritual bull sacrifice in the Temple of Poseidon. The prominent role of maritime imagery in Minoan art, from dolphin frescoes to ship representations, reinforced the connection to Plato's emphasis on Atlantean naval power and oceanic orientation. The apparent peaceful character of early Minoan civilization, evidenced by the absence of fortification walls around major settlements, suggested the kind of harmonious society that Plato attributed to early Atlantean periods before moral corruption set in. However, as archaeological investigation of Minoan civilization progressed and more sophisticated analytical methods were applied, the apparent parallels to Atlantis began to dissolve under closer scrutiny. The chronological framework established through pottery analysis and radiocarbon dating placed Minoan civilization firmly within the 2nd millennium BC, far removed from the 9500 BC date that Plato had specified for Atlantis. The geographical scale of Minoan influence, while impressive for its time period, remained limited to the eastern Mediterranean region rather than encompassing the global empire that Plato attributed to Atlantis. More fundamentally, detailed analysis of Minoan society revealed characteristics that contradicted essential elements of Plato's account. The decentralized political structure of Minoan Crete, with multiple palace centers operating as independent or semi-independent entities, differed markedly from the unified imperial system that Plato described for Atlantis. The absence of evidence for large-scale military organization or aggressive expansion contradicted Plato's emphasis on Atlantean imperialism and the threat it posed to ancient Athens. The peaceful collapse of many Minoan sites, apparently abandoned rather than destroyed in warfare, failed to match the dramatic military confrontation that formed the climax of Plato's narrative. The investigation of other Bronze Age civilizations that had been proposed as potential Atlantis candidates produced similar patterns of initial apparent parallels, followed by more detailed analysis that revealed fundamental incompatibilities with Plato's account. The Mycenaean civilization of mainland Greece, with its impressive fortified palaces and evidence of extensive maritime activity, seemed to offer another possible historical basis for the Atlantis story. The Mycenaean Linear B tablets revealed a complex bureaucratic system capable of organizing large-scale military and economic activities, while archaeological evidence suggested Mycenaean influence extended throughout the Mediterranean region during the late 2nd millennium BC. Yet systematic analysis of Mycenaean civilization revealed the same chronological and geographical limitations that affected other proposed Atlantis candidates. The Mycenaean world, while impressive in its regional context, operated on a scale far smaller than what Plato attributed to Atlantis. The collapse of Mycenaean civilization around 1200 BC occurred through a gradual process of political fragmentation and economic decline, rather than the sudden catastrophic destruction described in Plato's account. Most significantly, the Mycenaean civilization developed within the familiar Mediterranean world, rather than in the Atlantic Ocean location that Plato had specified for Atlantis. The discovery of the Uluburun shipwreck off the Turkish coast in 1982 provided dramatic evidence of the extensive trade networks that connected Bronze Age civilizations across the Mediterranean, revealing a level of international commerce and cultural exchange that exceeded what many scholars had previously imagined possible for the period. The ship's cargo included raw materials and finished goods from across the known world, including Cypriot copper, Nubian gold, Baltic amber and African ivory, demonstrating that Bronze Age civilizations possessed the maritime capabilities and commercial networks necessary to support the kind of far-flung empire that Plato attributed to Atlantis. However, this evidence of Bronze Age maritime sophistication, rather than supporting Atlantis theories, actually highlighted the absence of any archaeological trace of the massive Atlantic civilization that would have been necessary to coordinate such global activities. The Uluburun cargo could be traced to known sources throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, with each item corresponding to documented production centres and established trade routes. The absence of any artefacts that could be attributed to an unknown Atlantic civilization became increasingly significant as archaeological knowledge of Bronze Age trade networks expanded and became more precise. The development of underwater archaeology during the mid-20th century provided new opportunities to investigate claims about submerged Atlantean ruins, while simultaneously revealing the technical challenges and evidentiary standards necessary for legitimate marine archaeological research. Jacques Cousteau's pioneering work with underwater exploration equipment during the 1940s and 1950s demonstrated the feasibility of systematic archaeological investigation beneath the ocean's surface, while the development of side-scan sonar and other remote sensing technologies made it possible to survey large areas of the ocean floor for potential archaeological sites. The systematic survey of the Atlantic Ocean floor conducted by various oceanographic institutions during the second half of the 20th century produced detailed bathymetric maps that revealed the actual topography of the regions where Atlantis had been proposed to have existed. These surveys demonstrated that the Atlantic Ocean floor consisted primarily of abyssal plains lying at depths of 3,000 to 4,000 meters below sea level, with no evidence of recently submerged continental land masses that could have supported large-scale civilization during the time period suggested by various Atlantis theories. The geological analysis of Atlantic Ocean sediment cores provided additional evidence against the existence of any large landmass in the Atlantic during the periods when Atlantis was supposed to have existed. The sediment layers revealed a consistent pattern of deep ocean deposition extending back millions of years, with no indication of the dramatic geological changes that would have been necessary to submerge a continent-sized landmass within the last 12,000 years. The absence of terrestrial sediments, pollen, or other indicators of nearby land surfaces in the deep Atlantic contradicted claims about recently submerged civilizations. The investigation of the mid-Atlantic ridge system revealed the actual geological processes operating in the Atlantic Ocean, demonstrating that the seafloor spreading occurring along this underwater mountain chain was gradually expanding the ocean rather than submerging existing land masses. The volcanic islands associated with the mid-Atlantic ridge, including the Azores, Iceland and various smaller island chains, represented recent geological formations created by volcanic activity rather than remnants of submerged continents. The geological age of these formations, established through radiometric dating of volcanic rocks, place their emergence far more recently than the periods proposed for Atlantean civilization. The search for Atlantean ruins in the Caribbean region, inspired by Edgar Cayce's psychic readings and various other alternative theories, produced numerous claims about underwater structures that initially seemed to support the existence of advanced ancient civilizations in Atlantic waters. The Bimini Road Formation off the Bahamas, first publicized in 1968, consisted of rectangular stone blocks arranged in linear patterns on the ocean floor that some researchers interpreted as the remains of ancient roadways or building foundations. The geometric regularity of these formations and their apparent artificial construction suggested to some investigators that they represented archaeological evidence of pre-Columbian civilization in the region. However, detailed geological analysis of the Bimini Road Formation revealed that the rectangular blocks consisted of naturally fractured limestone that had broken along regular joint patterns due to geological stress and chemical weathering processes. The linear arrangement of the blocks resulted from natural geological processes rather than human construction, while the apparent artificial appearance reflected the tendency of limestone to fracture along regular geometric patterns when subjected to particular combinations of geological forces. The dating of the limestone formation placed its origin millions of years before any possible human presence in the region. Similar patterns of initial excitement followed by scientific debunking characterized numerous other claimed discoveries of underwater Atlantean ruins throughout the Atlantic and Caribbean regions. The Yonaguni Monument off Japan, while located in the Pacific rather than Atlantic Ocean, provided another example of natural geological formations that could create the appearance of artificial construction under certain conditions. The stepped terraces and geometric angles that some researchers interpreted as evidence of ancient architecture actually resulted from natural fracturing processes in sedimentary rock formations, as demonstrated through detailed geological analysis. The application of remote sensing technologies to the search for Atlantean ruins revealed both the capabilities and limitations of modern archaeological survey methods. Satellite imagery analysis could identify potential archaeological sites over large areas, while ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry could detect buried structures beneath land surfaces. However, these technologies also demonstrated the absence of any large-scale architectural remains in the regions where Atlantis had been proposed to have existed, despite surveys covering thousands of square kilometers of ocean floor and coastal areas. The investigation of sea level changes during the post-glacial period provided crucial evidence for evaluating claims about recently submerged civilizations. The detailed reconstruction of global sea level fluctuations since the last ice age, based on analysis of coral terraces, marine sediments, and other geological indicators, revealed that sea levels had risen approximately 120 meters since the glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago. This sea level rise had indeed submerged extensive coastal areas and would have destroyed any low-lying civilizations that existed during the glacial period. However, the chronology and geography of post-glacial sea level rise contradicted most Atlantis theories rather than supporting them. The major period of sea level rise occurred between 15,000 and 6,000 years ago, with the most rapid changes taking place before 10,000 years ago. By the time period when most advanced ancient civilizations were developing, sea levels had already stabilized near their current positions. The areas that were submerged by post-glacial sea level rise consisted primarily of continental shelf regions that would have supported only scattered hunter-gatherer populations rather than the advanced civilizations described in Atlantis literature. The geological investigation of catastrophic events during the time periods proposed for Atlantean destruction revealed evidence of various natural disasters that could have inspired ancient flood myths and accounts of civilizational collapse. The Younger Dryas period, lasting from approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, involved dramatic climate changes that disrupted human societies across large regions. Volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and tsunamis during various historical periods had indeed caused sudden destruction of coastal settlements and could have provided the basis for oral traditions about catastrophic floods and vanished civilizations. The Santorini volcanic eruption around 1600 BC created a massive tsunami that devastated coastal areas throughout the eastern Mediterranean, providing a plausible natural disaster that could have inspired later accounts of sudden civilizational destruction. The archaeological evidence of Minoan sites abandoned after this period suggested that the Santorini eruption had contributed to the collapse of Minoan civilization, creating a historical precedent for the kind of catastrophic destruction described in Plato's account. However, the scale and timing of this event remained far smaller and more recent than what Plato had described for Atlantis. The systematic comparison of ancient flood myths from different cultures revealed both similarities and differences that complicated attempts to trace them to a common historical source. While many cultures possessed traditions about great floods that had destroyed earlier civilizations, the details of these accounts varied significantly in their descriptions of causes, geographical extent, and survival patterns. The similarities that existed could be explained by the common human experience of flood disasters and the psychological tendency to project local catastrophes onto cosmic scales, rather than requiring a single historical event that had affected all cultures simultaneously. The peer review process that characterized professional archaeological and geological research provided systematic mechanisms for evaluating claims about ancient civilizations and ensuring that conclusions were based on reliable evidence rather than speculation or wishful thinking. The requirement that research findings be published in refereed journals, where they would be scrutinized by qualified experts before publication, created quality control standards that eliminated most unsupported claims about Atlantis while allowing legitimate discoveries to be properly documented and verified. The institutional structure of modern archaeology, with its university departments, professional organizations, and funding agencies, created both opportunities and constraints for investigating alternative theories about ancient civilizations. While this system could be conservative in its acceptance of new ideas, it also provided the resources and expertise necessary for conducting sophisticated research that could definitively resolve questions about proposed archaeological sites and historical claims. The absence of any major archaeological institution that had found convincing evidence for Atlantis reflected the consistent failure of such claims to meet professional evidentiary standards rather than academic prejudice against unconventional theories. The development of increasingly sophisticated analytical techniques continued to provide new tools for investigating ancient civilizations, while simultaneously raising the evidentiary standards necessary for establishing historical claims. DNA analysis of ancient human remains could trace population movements and cultural contacts with unprecedented precision, while isotopic analysis of artifacts could determine their geographical origins and manufacturing techniques. These methods consistently revealed the complexity and interconnectedness of ancient civilizations, while failing to provide any evidence for the kind of advanced Atlantic civilization described in Atlantis literature. The 20th and 21st centuries witnessed an unprecedented proliferation of Atlantis theories, as advances in underwater exploration, satellite imaging, and geological analysis provided new tools for investigating ancient mysteries while simultaneously inspiring fresh speculation about possible locations for Plato's lost civilization. Unlike earlier centuries when Atlantis researchers worked primarily from textual analysis and limited archaeological knowledge, modern theorists could draw upon detailed bathymetric surveys precise dating techniques and comprehensive databases of ancient civilizations to support their claims. This wealth of new information, however, produced divergent rather than convergent theories, with different researchers identifying potential Atlantis sites across virtually every ocean and continent on Earth. The Mediterranean hypothesis gained renewed attention following Spiridon Marinatos' systematic investigation of Bronze Age Aegean civilizations and their relationship to natural catastrophes. Marinatos, working as the Greek Archaeological Service's Inspector General during the 1930s, had noticed extensive pumice deposits at Minoan sites on Crete that suggested volcanic destruction rather than military conquest. His subsequent excavations at Akrotiri on the island of Santorini beginning in 1967 revealed a remarkably preserved Bronze Age city buried beneath volcanic ash, providing dramatic evidence of the catastrophic eruption that had devastated the region around 1600 BC. The Akrotiri excavations revealed a sophisticated urban civilization, with multi-story buildings, advanced drainage systems, and elaborate frescoes depicting maritime scenes and exotic animals. The sudden abandonment of the city, with valuable objects left in place and no evidence of looting or gradual decline, suggested that the inhabitants had fled quickly in the face of volcanic warning signs before the final catastrophic eruption. The scale of the Santorini eruption, estimated to have been 4 times larger than the 1883 Krakatoa explosion, would have generated massive tsunamis capable of devastating coastal settlements throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Marinatos argued that this catastrophic destruction of Minoan civilization provided the historical foundation for Plato's Atlantis narrative, transmitted through Egyptian records and eventually reaching Solon during his travels. The geographical details in Plato's account, according to this interpretation, had been distorted through centuries of oral transmission, with the original Aegean location transformed into an Atlantic setting that placed the story beyond the reach of contemporary verification. The concentric rings of land and water that Plato attributed to Atlantis could represent a garbled memory of Santorini's circular caldera, formed by the collapse of the volcanic cone during the Bronze Age eruption. The chronological discrepancy between the Santorini eruption around 1600 BC and Plato's dating of Atlantis to 9500 BC presented a significant challenge to this interpretation, leading to various explanations involving Egyptian calendar confusion or deliberate chronological manipulation by Plato. Some researchers suggested that Egyptian priests had confused lunar and solar years in their calculations, multiplying the actual time intervals by factors that would bring Plato's dating closer to the Bronze Age period. Others argued that Plato had deliberately antiquated his story to place it in a mythical golden age that would enhance its philosophical impact. The marine archaeological investigation of the Santorini caldera during the 1960s and 1970s sought evidence of submerged Bronze Age settlements that might support the Atlantis identification. Jacques Cousteau's expeditions using advanced underwater exploration equipment revealed volcanic deposits and geological formations, but failed to locate any significant archaeological remains on the caldera floor. The extreme depth of the caldera, reaching over 400 meters below sea level, and the massive volcanic deposits that had accumulated since the Bronze Age, made systematic archaeological survey extremely difficult. Alternative Mediterranean theories emerged as researchers applied similar catastrophist interpretations to other ancient civilizations and natural disasters. The Troy hypothesis, promoted by various German scholars during the 1980s, identified Plato's Atlantis with the legendary city of Troy, arguing that the Trojan War preserved memories of a great Bronze Age conflict between Eastern and Western powers. The recent discovery of a massive Bronze Age city at Hisarlik in Turkey with evidence of destruction and abandonment that matched aspects of Homeric accounts, provided archaeological support for treating ancient Greek epic traditions as historically grounded rather than purely mythological. The Sardinia hypothesis, developed by Italian researcher Sergio Frau, relocated Atlantis to the western Mediterranean by reinterpreting Plato's geographical references to the Pillars of Hercules. Frau argued that ancient sources had applied this designation to various narrow straits throughout the Mediterranean, not exclusively to the Strait of Gibraltar, making it possible that Plato's beyond the Pillars of Hercules actually referred to locations within the Mediterranean basin. The Sardinian civilization, known as the Nuragic culture, which flourished during the Bronze Age and constructed thousands of distinctive stone towers across the island, provided evidence of an advanced ancient society that had suddenly declined around 1200 BC. The archaeological investigation of Nuragic civilization revealed sophisticated metallurgical techniques, extensive trade networks, and complex social organization that seemed to match some aspects of Plato's Atlantean society. The circular stone towers that gave the culture its name displayed advanced engineering techniques and served both defensive and ceremonial functions within settlements that could support substantial populations. The sudden abandonment of many Nuragic sites during the Late Bronze Age suggested a catastrophic decline that might have inspired later traditions about vanished civilizations. However, the geographical scale of Sardinian civilization remained limited to a single Mediterranean island, rather than encompassing the vast territories and global influence that Plato attributed to Atlantis. The Nuragic culture, while impressive within its regional context, showed no evidence of the imperial expansion or military confrontation with ancient Athens that formed central elements of Plato's narrative. The dating of Nuragic decline to around 1200 BC, while closer to historical plausibility than Plato's 9500 BC, still required significant chronological adjustment to align with other aspects of the Atlantis account. The Black Sea hypothesis emerged from geological discoveries about dramatic sea level changes in the region during the early Holocene period, providing a potential mechanism for the sudden flooding of large land areas that might have supported ancient civilizations. William Ryan and Walter Pittman's research during the 1990s revealed evidence that the Black Sea had experienced a catastrophic flooding event around 7,500 years ago, when rising Mediterranean waters breached the natural dam at the Bosphorus Strait and flooded a vast freshwater lake that had existed at a much lower level. The scale of this flooding event, which would have raised Black Sea levels by more than 100 meters and submerged approximately 100,000 square kilometers of previously dry land, provided a plausible natural disaster that could have destroyed coastal civilizations and inspired flood myths that later influenced Plato's account. Archaeological surveys of the Black Sea floor using advanced sonar equipment revealed submerged river channels, beach ridges, and other features that confirmed the existence of extensive dry land areas before the flooding event. Robert Ballard's systematic exploration of the Black Sea floor using remotely operated vehicles discovered what appeared to be preserved wooden structures and other artifacts in the anoxic deep waters that prevented normal decay processes. The dating of these materials to approximately 7,000 years ago suggested human presence in the region before the catastrophic flooding, supporting theories about submerged civilizations that might have provided historical foundations for later flood traditions. The excellent preservation conditions in the Black Sea's oxygen-free deep waters offered unprecedented opportunities to study ancient organic materials that would have decomposed in normal marine environments. The Black Sea flooding theory gained additional support from genetic and linguistic studies that suggested rapid population dispersals from the region around 7,000 years ago. possibly representing refugee movements triggered by the catastrophic flood. The spread of Indo-European languages and associated cultural practices could potentially be traced to population movements originating in the Black Sea region during this period, providing a mechanism for the transmission of flood traditions across vast geographical areas. However, the archaeological evidence from the Black Sea region failed to reveal any advanced civilization comparable to what Plato described for Atlantis. The submerged settlements discovered by Ballard and other researchers appear to represent simple farming communities rather than the sophisticated urban civilization with advanced technology and imperial organization that characterized Plato's account. The absence of monumental architecture, complex water management systems, or evidence of long-distance trade networks contradicted essential elements of the Atlantis narrative. Atlantic theories experienced a renaissance during the late 20th century as improved oceanographic survey techniques made it possible to investigate previously inaccessible areas of the ocean floor with unprecedented precision. The discovery of the Azores Plateau, a large submarine elevation in the central Atlantic that had been above sea level during various geological periods, provided a potential location for Atlantean civilization that matched Plato's geographical specifications while offering a plausible mechanism for subsequent submersion. The geological investigation of the Azores Plateau revealed a complex history of volcanic activity and sea level changes that had alternately exposed and submerged different portions of the region over millions of years. During the last ice age, when global sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than today, substantial portions of the plateau would have formed islands, or even continuous land masses capable of supporting large populations. The subsequent post-glacial sea level rise could have submerged these areas, creating the kind of sudden disappearance that Plato attributed to Atlantis. The bathymetric mapping of the Azores region using multi-beam sonar systems revealed underwater topographical features that some researchers interpreted as possible artificial structures, including what appeared to be rectangular formations and linear arrangements of elevated areas that might represent submerged building foundations or harbour works. The Portuguese government sponsored several underwater archaeological expeditions during the 1990s to investigate these features, using advanced remotely operated vehicles capable of detailed seafloor survey and sample collection. The results of these investigations proved disappointing for Atlantis enthusiasts, as detailed examination revealed that the apparent artificial structures consisted of natural geological formations created by volcanic activity and sedimentary processes. The rectangular patterns that had seemed to suggest human construction actually resulted from regular fracturing and volcanic rock formations, while the linear arrangements reflected natural geological processes rather than deliberate architectural planning. The absence of any artifacts, building materials, or other evidence of human presence in the areas investigated contradicted claims about submerged Atlantean ruins. The Canary Islands hypothesis, promoted by various Spanish researchers, identified these Atlantic islands as potential remnants of a larger Atlantean landmass that had been reduced to its current size through geological processes. The Guanche civilization that had inhabited the islands before European conquest displayed some advanced characteristics, including sophisticated astronomical knowledge, elaborate burial practices, and agricultural techniques adapted to volcanic island conditions. The mysterious disappearance of Guanche culture following Spanish colonization provided a historical parallel to the destruction of Atlantis described by Plato. Archaeological investigation of Guanche sites revealed stone construction techniques, including Cyclopean masonry using massive blocks fitted together without mortar, that seemed to echo descriptions of Atlantean architecture. The discovery of step pyramids and other monumental structures on several Canary Islands suggested a level of social organisation and construction capability that exceeded what might be expected from an isolated island civilization. The presence of mummified remains preserved in elaborate burial chambers indicated sophisticated knowledge of preservation techniques that paralleled practices found in ancient Egypt and other advanced civilizations. However, the chronological framework established for Guanche civilization through radiocarbon dating and other techniques placed its development well within the historical period, beginning around 1000 BC and continuing until Spanish conquest in the 15th century AD. This timing contradicted both Plato's ancient dating for Atlantis and the various alternative chronologies proposed by modern theorists. The geographical scale of the Canary Islands, while impressive for their isolated Atlantic location, remained far smaller than the continental dimensions that Plato attributed to Atlantis. The Antarctica hypothesis emerged from the controversial work of Charles Hapgood and his theory of crustal displacement, which proposed that the Earth's outer crust could shift rapidly relative to the inner core, causing dramatic changes in the geographical positions of continents and climate zones. According to this theory, Antarctica had been located in a temperate climate zone as recently as 12,000 years ago, potentially supporting the advanced civilization described as Atlantis, before crustal displacement moved the continent to its current polar position. Hapgood's analysis of medieval maps, particularly the Piri Reis map of 1513, suggested that ancient civilizations had possessed accurate geographical knowledge of Antarctica's coastline before it was covered by ice sheets. The detailed depiction of what appeared to be Antarctic coastal features in these maps, created centuries before the continent's official discovery in 1820, implied the existence of advanced ancient navigation and cartographic capabilities that might support theories about lost civilizations with global reach. The geological investigation of Antarctic ice cores and sediment deposits provided evidence of past climate conditions that could potentially support theories about temperate conditions in the region during recent geological periods. Some ice core data suggested periods of reduced ice coverage that might have made portions of Antarctica habitable, while marine sediment cores revealed evidence of ice-free coastal areas during various interglacial periods. The discovery of coal deposits and fossilized plant remains demonstrated that Antarctica had indeed supported temperate climates during earlier geological eras. However, the chronological framework established through multiple lines of geological evidence placed these temperate conditions millions of years before any possible human presence in the region. The Antarctic ice sheet had been continuously present for at least 15 million years, with only minor fluctuations in extent that never exposed substantial ice-free land areas during the period when human civilizations might have existed. The crustal displacement theory that formed the foundation of the Antarctica hypothesis lacked support from geological evidence and contradicted well-established understanding of tectonic processes. Contemporary researchers continue to propose new Atlantis locations based on emerging archaeological discoveries and improved analytical techniques, demonstrating the enduring appeal of Plato's narrative as an explanatory framework for ancient mysteries. The Donana National Park hypothesis, developed by German researcher Rainer Kuhne, identified a location in southwestern Spain where satellite imagery revealed circular and rectangular patterns that might represent the remains of Atlantean architecture buried beneath sedimentary deposits. The application of ground-penetrating radar and other geophysical survey techniques to the Donana site revealed subsurface anomalies that could potentially represent buried structures, though definitive archaeological investigation remained limited by the site's protected status as a national park. The geographical location of the site, near the mouth of the Guadalquivir River and close to the traditional location of the Pillars of Hercules, seemed to match Plato's geographical specifications more closely than many other proposed locations. The methodology employed by contemporary Atlantis researchers reveals both the strengths and limitations of modern archaeological and geological techniques when applied to speculative historical claims. Advanced remote sensing technologies can identify potential archaeological sites over large areas and detect buried structures that would be impossible to locate through conventional survey methods. However, these same technologies also demonstrate the rarity of significant archaeological anomalies and the frequency with which apparent artificial features prove to be natural geological formations upon detailed investigation. The peer review process that governs professional archaeological research provides systematic evaluation of claims about ancient civilizations, while maintaining standards of evidence that eliminate most speculative theories. The absence of any peer-reviewed archaeological publication that has validated claims about Atlantean ruins or artifacts reflects the consistent failure of such claims to meet professional evidentiary standards rather than academic prejudice against unconventional theories. The institutional structure of modern archaeology, with its emphasis on reproducible results and independent verification, creates quality control mechanisms that distinguish legitimate discoveries from wishful thinking or misinterpretation of natural phenomena. The psychological appeal of Atlantis theories continues to generate new proposals and interpretations despite the lack of archaeological support, reflecting deeper human needs for comprehensive explanations of historical mysteries and cultural achievements. The narrative structure of the Atlantis story, with its themes of lost wisdom, catastrophic destruction, and hidden knowledge, provides a compelling framework for understanding various archaeological anomalies and ancient achievements that seem to exceed conventional expectations about prehistoric human capabilities. The influence of popular media and alternative history publications has created self-reinforcing communities of Atlantis believers who share information and interpretations that support their preferred theories while dismissing contradictory evidence as the result of academic conspiracies or methodological limitations. The internet has facilitated the rapid spread of Atlantis theories and the coordination of research efforts among amateur investigators, creating networks of enthusiasts who can maintain belief systems independently of professional archaeological consensus. The critical evaluation of modern Atlantis theories requires careful attention to the distinction between legitimate archaeological questions and speculative historical claims that extend beyond available evidence. While many proposed Atlantis locations correspond to genuine archaeological sites that merit professional investigation, the interpretation of these sites as remnants of Plato's specific lost civilization typically involves assumptions and connections that cannot be supported through rigorous analysis. The tendency to identify superficial similarities between different ancient cultures as evidence of common Atlantean origin reflects the same methodological problems that characterized Donnelly's Victorian-era speculation, despite the availability of more sophisticated analytical tools. The ongoing search for Atlantis demonstrates both the enduring power of Plato's narrative and the challenges of distinguishing between legitimate historical investigation and wishful thinking in the interpretation of archaeological evidence. The proliferation of proposed locations and theories, rather than converging toward a consensus solution, suggests that the Atlantis story functions more effectively as a mythological framework for understanding human aspirations and fears than as a historical account amenable to archaeological verification. The transformation of Atlantis from an obscure philosophical dialogue into a dominant cultural phenomenon began with Jules Verne's groundbreaking novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, published in 1870. Verne's vivid description of Captain Nemo's underwater encounter with the ruins of Atlantis captured the Victorian imagination with unprecedented force, establishing visual and narrative conventions that would influence popular depictions for more than a century. The scene where Nemo and Professor Aronnax explore the submerged city through the Nautilus's observation windows presented Atlantis as a tangible archaeological reality rather than abstract philosophical allegory, complete with crumbling temples, fallen statues, and the detritus of a once great civilization preserved beneath the ocean's protective embrace. Verne's technical background as an engineer and his meticulous research into contemporary scientific developments lent credibility to his underwater exploration scenarios that purely fantastical treatments could not achieve. His detailed descriptions of diving equipment, underwater navigation, and marine archaeology reflected genuine technological possibilities while extending them into speculative territories that seemed scientifically plausible to contemporary readers. The Nautilus itself, with its advanced propulsion systems and life support capabilities, represented the kind of technological achievement that might have been possible for an advanced ancient civilization, creating implicit connections between Atlantean capabilities and modern scientific progress. The literary impact of Verne's Atlantis extended far beyond the specific scene in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea to establish a template for adventure fiction that combined exotic locations, advanced technology, and archaeological mystery. His approach influenced subsequent generations of adventure writers who adopted similar formulas of lost civilizations discovered through technological means, creating a subgenre that would eventually encompass everything from Edgar Rice Burroughs' Pellucidar novels to modern techno-thrillers featuring underwater exploration and ancient secrets. H.G. Wells's contribution to Atlantis literature took a different approach, emphasizing social and political themes rather than technological adventure. His short story The Sleeper Awakes, while not directly about Atlantis, established narrative patterns about advanced ancient civilizations whose social experiments provided warnings about contemporary political developments. Wells's background in social theory and his concerns about industrial society's direction influenced his treatment of lost civilization themes, using them as vehicles for exploring questions about technological progress, social organization, and the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare. The emergence of pulp magazines during the early 20th century created new markets for Atlantis fiction, while establishing stylistic conventions that emphasized action, adventure, and spectacular imagery over literary sophistication or historical accuracy. Publications like Amazing Stories, Weird Tales, and Adventure provided regular outlets for stories featuring underwater cities, ancient technologies, and the descendants of Atlantean survivors living in hidden enclaves around the world. The economic pressures of pulp publishing, which demanded rapid production and immediate reader engagement, encouraged writers to develop increasingly elaborate and sensational versions of Atlantis themes. Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, beginning in the 1930s, integrated Atlantis into a comprehensive fictional prehistory that positioned the lost continent as the foundation for all subsequent human civilizations. Howard's Hyborian Age chronology placed Atlantis and its sister continent Lemuria as the pinnacles of the first great cycle of human civilization, whose destruction had scattered survivors across the globe to establish the various kingdoms and cultures that formed the setting for Conan's adventures. This approach allowed Howard to draw upon the comparative mythology and archaeological speculation that characterized contemporary Atlantis theories, while creating an internally consistent fictional framework that could support extended narrative development. Howard's depiction of Atlantean society emphasized its decadence and moral corruption, reflecting both Plato's original themes and contemporary anxieties about modern civilization's direction. The Atlanteans in Howard's stories possessed advanced magical and technological capabilities, but had become effete and spiritually weak, making them vulnerable to the barbarian vitality represented by characters like Conan. This interpretation resonated with Depression-era concerns about the relationship between civilizational sophistication and cultural vitality, providing metaphorical frameworks for understanding contemporary social and economic challenges. The influence of theosophical and occult interpretations of Atlantis became increasingly prominent in popular literature during the mid-20th century, as writers incorporated esoteric concepts about root races, spiritual evolution, and hidden masters into adventure and science fiction narratives. Authors like A. Merritt and Abraham Merritt developed elaborate fantasies featuring Atlantean survivors who had preserved ancient wisdom and supernatural powers through millennia of hidden existence. These stories typically involved modern protagonists who discovered lost Atlantean colonies in remote locations, where they encountered advanced beings who possessed both technological capabilities and spiritual knowledge that exceeded contemporary human achievements. The post-World War II era witnessed a significant expansion in Atlantis-themed literature as writers grappled with the implications of nuclear weapons, space exploration, and rapid technological change. The atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki provided a contemporary parallel to the catastrophic destruction that had supposedly ended Atlantean civilization, making Plato's narrative seem more relevant and immediate to modern readers. Science fiction writers began exploring themes about advanced ancient civilizations that had destroyed themselves through technological hubris, creating cautionary tales that used Atlantis as a metaphor for the dangers of uncontrolled scientific progress. Isaac Asimov's approach to Atlantis themes in his Foundation series demonstrated how sophisticated science fiction writers could use lost civilization concepts to explore complex ideas about historical cycles, technological development, and social organization. While Asimov did not directly feature Atlantis in his stories, his treatment of the fall of the Galactic Empire and the preservation of knowledge through the Foundation paralleled many traditional Atlantis themes while grounding them in rigorous scientific and sociological speculation. This approach influenced subsequent science fiction writers who sought to create more intellectually sophisticated treatments of ancient wisdom and civilizational collapse. The development of fantasy literature as a distinct genre during the 1960s and 1970s created new opportunities for elaborate Atlantis narratives that could explore magical and mythological themes without the scientific constraints that limited science fiction treatments. Writers like Lynn Carter, L. Sprague de Camp, and Catherine L. Moore developed extensive Atlantis-based fantasy series that incorporated elements from various occult and archaeological theories while creating original mythologies that could support extended narrative development. These works typically featured elaborate magical systems, complex political intrigue, and detailed world-building that presented Atlantis as a fully realized fictional civilization rather than simply an exotic adventure setting. The emergence of sword and sorcery fiction as a popular subgenre provided additional venues for Atlantis-themed stories that emphasized action and adventure over complex plotting or character development. Writers in this tradition, following Howard's example, used Atlantean settings to create scenarios involving powerful warriors, evil sorcerers, and ancient treasures that could drive fast-paced adventure narratives. The formulaic nature of much sword and sorcery fiction led to the development of standard Atlantis tropes, including crystal-powered technology, fish people descendants of Atlantean survivors, and underwater cities protected by magical barriers. The influence of comic books on popular Atlantis imagery proved particularly significant in establishing visual conventions that would later influence film and television adaptations. DC Comics' Aquaman, first appearing in 1941, presented Atlantis as a thriving underwater kingdom whose inhabitants had adapted to marine life while retaining advanced technology and sophisticated social organization. The comic book medium's emphasis on visual spectacle encouraged artists to develop increasingly elaborate depictions of Atlantean architecture, technology, and marine life that created lasting impressions on popular consciousness about how the lost civilization might have appeared. Marvel Comics' treatment of Atlantis through the character of Namor the Submariner offered a more complex and morally ambiguous interpretation that reflected contemporary concerns about environmentalism and cultural conflict. Namor's role as both hero and antagonist, defending Atlantean interests against surface world encroachment while sometimes threatening innocent humans, provided metaphorical frameworks for exploring themes about cultural misunderstanding, environmental destruction, and the costs of technological progress. The visual representation of Atlantis in Marvel Comics emphasized its alien and threatening aspects, while maintaining enough familiar elements to remain comprehensible to readers. The development of television as a mass medium during the 1950s and 1960s created new opportunities for Atlantis-themed entertainment, while imposing technical and budgetary constraints that influenced how the lost civilization could be depicted. Early television productions like Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea featured episodes involving underwater exploration and ancient ruins that drew upon established Atlantis themes while adapting them to the limitations of television production. The need to create convincing underwater scenes on limited budgets led to the development of visual techniques and design approaches that would influence subsequent film and television treatments. The 1970s television series Man from Atlantis represented the first major attempt to create an ongoing series centered entirely on Atlantis themes, featuring Patrick Duffy as the last survivor of the lost civilization who possessed superhuman swimming abilities and could communicate with marine life. The series' premise allowed for weekly adventures involving underwater exploration, ancient Atlantean technology, and conflicts between Atlantean values and modern human society. Despite its relatively short run, the series established visual and narrative conventions for depicting Atlanteans as adapted to marine life while retaining essentially human characteristics and motivations. The influence of Disney's animated films on popular Atlantis imagery reached its culmination with Atlantis: The Lost Empire in 2001, which presented a comprehensive vision of Atlantean civilization that drew upon decades of popular culture development while introducing original elements that would influence subsequent treatments. The film's depiction of Atlantis as a massive underground cavern city powered by a mysterious crystal energy source incorporated elements from various alternative archaeology theories, while creating visually spectacular sequences that demonstrated the possibilities of modern animation technology for depicting fantastic civilizations. Disney's approach to Atlantean technology emphasized its integration with natural forms and processes, presenting advanced machines that resembled living organisms and architectural structures that appeared to grow organically from rock formations. This biomechanical aesthetic reflected contemporary interests in environmentally sustainable technology, while creating distinctive visual signatures that distinguished Disney's Atlantis from previous film and television treatments. The film's emphasis on linguistic authenticity, featuring a constructed Atlantean language developed by linguist Mark Okrand, demonstrated the level of detail that modern productions could bring to fictional civilizations. The emergence of computer-generated imagery as a dominant film technology during the 1990s and 2000s revolutionized the possibilities for depicting underwater civilizations and ancient architecture with unprecedented realism and scale. Films like The Abyss and Waterworld demonstrated how digital effects could create convincing underwater environments and massive architectural structures that would have been impossible to achieve through traditional filmmaking techniques. These technological capabilities encouraged filmmakers to develop increasingly ambitious Atlantis projects that could present the lost civilization with visual grandeur matching the scale suggested by Plato's original descriptions. The influence of video games on Atlantis imagery became increasingly significant as gaming technology advanced to support complex three-dimensional environments and detailed character modelling. Games like Tomb Raider, Assassin's Creed, and various role-playing games featured extensive underwater exploration sequences and ancient ruins that drew upon established Atlantis visual conventions while allowing players to interact directly with these environments. The interactive nature of gaming created opportunities for more detailed exploration of Atlantean architecture and technology than passive media could provide, leading to increasingly elaborate and internally consistent depictions of the lost civilization. The development of massively multiplayer online games created persistent virtual worlds that could support ongoing Atlantis-themed content and allow thousands of players to explore underwater cities and ancient ruins together. Games like World of Warcraft and Guild Wars featured extensive underwater zones with elaborate Atlantis-inspired architecture and storylines that drew upon various mythological and popular culture sources. The collaborative nature of online gaming encouraged the development of detailed background lore and consistent visual design that could support extended player engagement with Atlantean themes. The influence of documentary television programming on popular Atlantis imagery proved particularly significant in blurring the boundaries between entertainment and education, as producers created programs that presented speculative theories about the lost civilization, using the visual conventions and authoritative tone associated with legitimate historical documentaries. Programs on the History Channel, Discovery Channel, and similar networks featured dramatic recreations of Atlantean civilization that incorporated elements from various alternative archaeology theories while presenting them with production values and narrative techniques that suggested scholarly legitimacy. The ancient aliens phenomenon represented the culmination of this trend towards documentary-style presentation of speculative theories, featuring elaborate computer-generated recreations of supposed Atlantean technology and architecture that drew upon decades of popular culture development while claiming scientific and historical authority. These programs' influence on popular consciousness proved substantial, creating widely shared visual expectations about how Atlantean civilization should appear, while reinforcing alternative historical narratives that positioned the lost continent as evidence of ancient extraterrestrial contact or advanced prehistoric human capabilities. The impact of internet culture on Atlantis mythology created new opportunities for collaborative development of alternative historical narratives, while facilitating the rapid spread of speculative theories and visual interpretations. Online communities dedicated to alternative archaeology and ancient mysteries could share research, debate theories, and develop increasingly elaborate explanations for various archaeological anomalies that incorporated Atlantis themes. The democratic nature of internet publishing allowed individuals without traditional credentials to present their theories to global audiences, while bypassing the peer review processes that characterized academic publishing. The emergence of streaming video platforms created new markets for Atlantis-themed content, while reducing the barriers to entry for independent filmmakers and content creators. YouTube channels dedicated to ancient mysteries could produce regular content featuring Atlantis theories and visual recreations that reached audiences comparable to traditional television programming, while operating with minimal budgets and production constraints. This democratization of media production led to an unprecedented proliferation of Atlantis-related content that reflected diverse cultural perspectives and theoretical approaches. The influence of contemporary environmental concerns on modern Atlantis narratives became increasingly prominent as climate change and ocean pollution emerged as major global issues. Recent treatments of Atlantis themes often emphasize the civilization's relationship with marine ecosystems and the environmental consequences of advanced technology, using the lost continent as a metaphor for contemporary anxieties about sustainability and ecological destruction. These interpretations typically present Atlantean civilization as either a cautionary example of environmental exploitation or a model of sustainable technology that modern society should emulate. The development of virtual and augmented reality technologies created new possibilities for immersive Atlantis experiences that could transport users directly into underwater cities and ancient ruins with unprecedented realism. VR applications featuring Atlantis exploration allowed users to swim through detailed three-dimensional reconstructions of the lost civilization while interacting with its architecture and inhabitants in ways that traditional media could not provide. These technologies promise to create the most convincing and engaging Atlantis experiences ever developed, while raising new questions about the relationship between fictional narratives and experiential reality. The globalization of popular culture during the late 20th and early 21st centuries facilitated the spread of Atlantis themes across different national and cultural contexts, while encouraging the development of localized interpretations that incorporated regional mythological and historical elements. Japanese anime and manga featuring Atlantis themes often emphasized the civilization's relationship with spiritual and supernatural forces, while European productions typically focused on archaeological and historical aspects of the lost continent. These cultural variations demonstrated how Atlantis themes could be adapted to different storytelling traditions and audience expectations, while maintaining core narrative elements that transcended cultural boundaries. The preservation and distortion of Plato's original account through popular culture created complex relationships between the philosophical source text and its countless adaptations and interpretations. While most popular treatments retained basic elements like the island location, advanced civilization, and catastrophic destruction, they typically eliminated or transformed the moral and political themes that had been central to Plato's original purpose. The emphasis on adventure, spectacle, and technological wonder in popular adaptations reflected contemporary entertainment values rather than ancient philosophical concerns, creating versions of Atlantis that bore only superficial resemblance to their classical source, while claiming historical and cultural authority. The transformation of Plato's philosophical allegory into a global cultural phenomenon reveals fundamental aspects of human psychology that transcend historical periods, technological capabilities, and cultural boundaries. The persistent appeal of Atlantis across more than 2 millennia demonstrates how certain narrative structures satisfy deep-seated psychological needs, while adapting to changing social circumstances and intellectual frameworks. Understanding why Atlantis continues to captivate modern audiences requires examining the psychological mechanisms that make lost civilization narratives compelling, the ways these stories reflect contemporary anxieties and aspirations, and their relationship to broader patterns of alternative historical thinking that challenge established academic authority. The archetypal structure of the Atlantis narrative taps into universal psychological patterns that Carl Jung identified as fundamental components of human consciousness. The story of a golden age followed by moral decline and catastrophic destruction resonates with mythological themes found across cultures, from the Garden of Eden to the Hindu concept of cyclical yugas. These narratives provide frameworks for understanding both individual and collective experiences of loss, failure, and the consequences of moral choices. The Atlantis story offers a particularly compelling version of this archetypal pattern because it combines the grandeur of advanced civilization with the finality of complete destruction, creating emotional resonance that purely abstract moral teachings cannot achieve. The psychological appeal of lost wisdom represents another crucial factor in Atlantis' enduring popularity. Modern individuals, overwhelmed by rapid technological change and the fragmentation of knowledge into increasingly specialized disciplines, find comfort in narratives that promise comprehensive understanding and integrated wisdom. The idea that an ancient civilization possessed complete knowledge of natural laws, spiritual principles, and technological applications offers hope that such integration remains possible despite contemporary intellectual fragmentation. This appeal explains why Atlantis theories often emphasize the civilization's supposed mastery of both material and spiritual domains, presenting a model of human achievement that transcends the perceived limitations of modern specialized knowledge. The democratization of knowledge through internet technologies has created unprecedented opportunities for individuals to develop and promote alternative historical theories without traditional academic credentials or institutional support. Online communities dedicated to Atlantis research can share information, coordinate investigations, and develop elaborate theoretical frameworks that operate independently of professional archaeological consensus. These communities often exhibit characteristics of what Richard Hofstadter identified as the paranoid style in American politics, interpreting academic skepticism toward their theories as evidence of deliberate suppression rather than methodological rigor. The emotional investment that participants develop in their alternative historical narratives creates self-reinforcing belief systems that become increasingly resistant to contradictory evidence. Contemporary environmental anxieties have profoundly influenced modern interpretations of the Atlantis narrative, transforming it from a story about political and moral corruption into a cautionary tale about technological hubris and ecological destruction. Climate change, ocean pollution, and biodiversity loss provide contemporary parallels to the catastrophic destruction that supposedly ended Atlantean civilization, making Plato's ancient account seem prophetically relevant to current global challenges. Modern Atlantis narratives often emphasize the civilization's relationship with natural forces and the environmental consequences of advanced technology, reflecting contemporary concerns about sustainability and the long-term viability of industrial civilization. The portrayal of Atlantean technology in contemporary popular culture reveals significant anxieties about the relationship between technological progress and human welfare. Unlike Victorian-era interpretations that celebrated technological advancement as unqualified progress, modern treatments often present Atlantean technology as simultaneously miraculous and dangerous, capable of creating unprecedented prosperity while threatening civilizational survival. This ambivalent attitude reflects contemporary experiences with nuclear weapons, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and other powerful technologies that promise both tremendous benefits and existential risks. The Atlantis narrative provides a framework for exploring these technological anxieties through the safe distance of ancient history. The search for alternative explanations of human achievement represents another significant factor in Atlantis's contemporary appeal, particularly among individuals who feel alienated from mainstream academic and scientific institutions. The idea that ancient civilizations possess capabilities exceeding those of modern society challenges conventional narratives about human progress while offering hope that current limitations might be transcended through the recovery of lost knowledge. This appeal explains the persistent popularity of theories about ancient astronauts, advanced prehistoric civilizations, and suppressed archaeological discoveries that supposedly demonstrate humanity's forgotten potential. The relationship between Atlantis belief and broader patterns of pseudo-archaeological thinking reveals systematic approaches to evidence evaluation that prioritize emotional satisfaction over methodological rigor. Pseudo-archaeological theories typically begin with desired conclusions about human history or capabilities, then selectively gather evidence that appears to support these conclusions, while dismissing contradictory information as the result of academic bias or conspiracy. This approach creates internally consistent belief systems that can accommodate virtually any new information while maintaining their core assumptions about ancient civilizations and hidden knowledge. The visual culture surrounding Atlantis has evolved to incorporate increasingly sophisticated computer-generated imagery and virtual reality technologies that can create convincing depictions of underwater cities and ancient architecture. These visual representations often become more influential than textual descriptions in shaping popular expectations about how Atlantean civilization should appear, creating feedback loops where new theories must conform to established visual conventions to gain acceptance. The proliferation of detailed Atlantis imagery across multiple media platforms has created a shared visual vocabulary that makes the lost civilization seem familiar and real, despite the absence of archaeological evidence. The commercialization of Atlantis themes through tourism, entertainment, and alternative education markets has created economic incentives for promoting speculative theories regardless of their scholarly merit. Tourist destinations claiming connections to Atlantean civilization, documentary programs featuring dramatic recreations of the lost continent, and books promising to reveal ancient secrets all benefit financially from maintaining public interest in alternative historical narratives. These commercial pressures often encourage increasingly sensational claims and elaborate conspiracy theories that can capture public attention in competitive entertainment markets. The globalization of Atlantis mythology has facilitated its adaptation to diverse cultural contexts while maintaining core narrative elements that transcend local traditions. Japanese interpretations often emphasize spiritual and supernatural aspects of Atlantean civilization, while European treatments typically focus on archaeological and historical dimensions. American versions frequently incorporate themes about individual discovery and technological mastery that reflect distinctive cultural values. These variations demonstrate how flexible mythological frameworks can be adapted to different cultural contexts while serving similar psychological functions across diverse populations. The educational implications of widespread Atlantis belief present significant challenges for science education and critical thinking instruction. Students who have absorbed alternative historical narratives through popular media often approach formal education with preconceived notions about ancient civilizations that conflict with archaeological evidence and scientific methodology. Teachers must address these misconceptions while explaining why professional standards of evidence evaluation are necessary for distinguishing reliable knowledge from speculation. The popularity of alternative historical narratives highlights the need for improved science communication and media literacy education that can help individuals evaluate competing claims about the past. The persistence of Atlantis theories, despite consistent failure to produce archaeological evidence, reveals important insights about the relationship between belief systems and empirical investigation. The absence of physical remains from any advanced Atlantic civilization during the periods proposed by various theories has not diminished popular interest in the lost continent, but has instead encouraged increasingly elaborate explanations for why such evidence remains hidden or unrecognized. These explanations often involve claims about government cover-ups, academic conspiracies, or the inadequacy of conventional archaeological methods, creating unfalsifiable belief systems that can maintain themselves indefinitely regardless of empirical findings. The therapeutic functions of Atlantis narratives for individuals struggling with feelings of alienation, meaninglessness, or powerlessness in modern society deserve recognition alongside their more problematic aspects. Belief in ancient wisdom and lost civilizations can provide comfort, purpose, and community for people who feel disconnected from mainstream cultural institutions. The sense of special knowledge and hidden truth that accompanies alternative historical beliefs can offer psychological benefits that help individuals cope with personal challenges and social uncertainties. Understanding these therapeutic functions is crucial for developing effective approaches to science education that acknowledge emotional needs while promoting critical thinking skills. The future evolution of Atlantis mythology will likely continue to reflect changing technological capabilities, environmental concerns, and social anxieties while maintaining the core narrative elements that have sustained its appeal for over 2 millennia. Virtual and augmented reality technologies promise to create increasingly immersive Atlantis experiences that could blur the boundaries between fictional entertainment and historical education. Advances in underwater exploration and archaeological survey techniques will continue to provide new contexts for Atlantis speculation, while simultaneously revealing the absence of evidence for any advanced Atlantic civilization during proposed time periods. The role of Atlantis as a cultural touchstone for discussions about human potential, technological progress, and civilizational sustainability ensures its continued relevance regardless of archaeological discoveries or scholarly consensus. The story serves as a flexible metaphorical framework that can accommodate diverse interpretations and applications, while maintaining emotional resonance across different historical periods and cultural contexts. This adaptability explains why Atlantis has survived the debunking of specific theories and will likely continue to evolve in response to future social and technological developments. The critical evaluation of Atlantis claims provides valuable opportunities for developing and demonstrating scientific methodology, archaeological reasoning, and historical analysis. The persistent popularity of alternative theories about the lost civilization creates ongoing teaching moments where educators can illustrate the differences between speculation and evidence-based conclusions, while explaining why professional standards of peer review and reproducible results are necessary for advancing human knowledge. The Atlantis phenomenon thus serves educational purposes that extend far beyond its specific historical claims to encompass broader questions about how we distinguish reliable knowledge from wishful thinking. The enduring legacy of Plato's Atlantis ultimately transcends questions about its historical accuracy to encompass fundamental issues about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between material progress and moral development. Whether interpreted as philosophical allegory, historical account, or modern mythology, the Atlantis narrative continues to provide frameworks for exploring these eternal questions while adapting to contemporary circumstances and concerns. Its persistence across diverse cultural contexts and historical periods demonstrates the power of well-crafted narratives to capture human imagination and provide meaning in ways that purely factual accounts cannot achieve. The phenomenon of Atlantis reveals both the strengths and limitations of human pattern-seeking behavior, showing how the same cognitive processes that enable scientific discovery and cultural innovation can also generate elaborate misconceptions and resistant belief systems. Understanding why Atlantis persists in human imagination requires acknowledging both its positive functions as a source of wonder, inspiration, and community, and its problematic aspects as a vehicle for pseudoscientific thinking and conspiracy theories. This balanced perspective offers the best foundation for appreciating the cultural significance of Plato's enduring creation while maintaining critical thinking skills necessary for distinguishing between compelling narratives and reliable historical knowledge. As humanity faces unprecedented global challenges requiring both technological innovation and wisdom about the consequences of our choices, the Atlantis story remains relevant as a cautionary tale about the relationship between power and responsibility. Whether the lost civilization existed as Plato described, served as metaphor for political corruption, or functions as modern mythology about human potential, its central message about the dangers of moral decline and the fragility of civilizational achievement speaks directly to contemporary concerns about sustainability, justice, and the future of human civilization. In this sense, Atlantis continues to serve its original purpose as a teaching tool for understanding the eternal challenges of human society, ensuring its place in human imagination for generations to come,